Hi there, viewers. Today, I'm joining in conversation with Makonnen Sankofa, the author of Life in Gambia, The Smiling Coast of Africa, and he's also the author of The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation. It's a pleasure to have Mr. Makonnen on the show. Hi there, Makonnen Sankofa.
Yes, I'm here from the beautiful smiling coast of Africa known as the Gambia. Thanks for having me on your show, Peter.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. I'm also joining you here from Nigeria. So Makonnen, let's talk about your best-selling book, The Rise of Rastafari. How does this book come about?
So, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation. It's a book that I initially published in May 2019, and it has been a revised edition that has come out, which came out almost 3 years since I released the first copy. So the revised edition come out in 2022. I think it's in April towards the start of May. It came out almost 3 years since I produced my original copy. The reason I originally produced The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, Repatriation, I wanted to dispel a lot of the misconceptions that people have about Rastafari. I find that people are very ignorant about Rastafari and what it is. And I mean, if it gets to me myself, I'm a Rastafarian, and I've been a Rasta since I've probably been about 20, 21. I'm 31 now, for at least a decade. And what I find is that when you talk about Rastafari, the things that often come into people's head are, just people that have locks, people that smoke ganja, vegetarianism, Bob Marley, but people don't seem to understand or the principles of Rastafari. They can't see it beyond just kind of like a culture or a trend or So I think it was very important for people to understand what exactly Rastafari is. And Rastafari is it's a Black Power and Pan-African movement that has a spiritual nucleus. It arose about in Jamaica in the 1930s following the coronation of Emperor Haile Selassie. And the significance of that is that, at that time, all the African nations were colonized by European powers. So Ethiopia, as the only independent nation, was significant. And then you also have the fact that, the context of the environment, people in the Caribbean hadn't seen, and I say the Caribbean because this is where the movement emerged, people in the Caribbean hadn't seen an image of, a Black king before until they saw the imagery of His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie. You're talking about Africans taken from parts of places like the Gambia, where I am, like Nigeria, where you're in, Peter, and other parts along the west coast of Africa, and then taken on ships and sent to places like the Caribbean and other parts of in Americas like Brazil, like America, etc. And then being forced to work on plantations and the brutalization, and obviously there was a process of seasoning where the African identity, the language, the culture, all of these things were stripped away. So it wasn't just the physical pressures of slavery and the brutalization physically, but also the mentally and the minds of our people. So there was a very much an inferiority complex of our people that still went on even after slavery ended in the Caribbean in, I believe it was 1834, and then it was followed by some years of apprenticeship, a few years of apprenticeship afterwards. But even though slavery ended in the Caribbean, there was still an inferiority complex in the minds of our people when they've been taught things African were backwards and negatively about Africa, and things European was the golden standard, and to look towards Europe, and things white were good and things black were bad. So Rastafari really came about to connect people with the identity, in terms of saying that we should look towards Africa because it's where we came from, and reconnect with our African roots, and we should be proud that we are African, and that it's not about worshipping. When Leonard Howell was the first member of the Rastafari, the first, known as the first Rasta, he was saying it's not about worshipping, the king of England anymore. It's like we've got our own king in Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, and we should look towards him, and we should look towards following on from a lot of Marcus Garvey's teachings, who we'll hear about later on. But a lot of the Rastafari, the founders and followers, a lot of them were Garveyites coming out of Marcus Garvey's organization. So it was really propagating something that Garvey was saying, that we should look towards, heading back towards repatriation to Africa, and we should see divinity within ourselves. And that was the importance of Haile Selassie, is to say that we must look at ourselves and see divinity within ourselves. and at a crucial time, you know, where a lot of the imagery that we had of, you know, what divinity was external images. You know, like a white image of Christ, and it was very, very important at a particular period of time, a movement. It's still important today. Rastafari is still important, but it was very, very crucial, particularly back then. And it's contributed a lot in terms of, you know, changing the awareness of people and what people think about Africa. A lot of us wouldn't be repatriated on the continent today if it wasn't for Rastafari, right? The influence of reggae music. So a lot of people would look down and think low of Rastafari, but you know what, reggae music wouldn't be reggae music if it wasn't for Rastafari. And Rastafari has made many contributions to the world that is often overlooked. Even, you know, hair. I mean, I don't have locks. You don't have to be a Rasta to have locks. The first early Rastas didn't have locks, but even if I want to say the importance of locks now, because Rasta has popularized locks more than any other group of people in the world, even though locks existed pre-Rasta in terms of the ancient Egyptians and it being around, and Rasta doesn't have any exclusive rights because there's many people that have locks that are not Rasta. It's Rastafarians that have popularized that hairstyle more than anyone else in the world, where people used to say it was dreadful and look down on people with locks. And now people are glorifying it. People are proud of their African hair color. People are looking at Africa in a different way than they looked at before. In the Caribbean, you couldn't, particularly in 1930s Jamaica, people used to tell people you're African, whatever, you know, that was just seen as something off, and people didn't want to connect to identify with Africa. So these are some of the reasons why it's important as well that, you know, what people understand Rastafari in terms of what it means in terms of identity. And what I think is important in Rastafari, and why I've written a book as well, I think a lot of Rastafarians come from more of a biblical perspective, and there is different views and different ideologies of Rastafari. So people do see it in a different way. But my viewpoint of Rastafari, and why I've looked, and it's not just my viewpoint, but there's other elders and other people that think in line with this as well, is from a non-biblical route of Rastafari. And I think that's very important because there's a lot of other books on Rastafari that have come down more from, you know what, well, validating Haile Selassie, or validating the movement from the Bible. But people also need to understand, you know, the Rastafari is actually much more beyond the Bible and the context of why the Bible was used in the environment of colonial Jamaica.
Oh, that's great. I love your deep explanation to that, and I need to say thank you for that. Now, you know, reading through the Rise of Rastafari, it is obvious that the Rastafarian is one of those group of people that have been persecuted in Jamaica by their fellow countrymen. Now, could you tell us more about the persecution of the Rastafarians?
Yeah, so since the inception of the movement in 1930s Jamaica, Rastafarians have been heavily persecuted, and not just in Jamaica. So Jamaica, I want to start and mention it, but then I'm also going to talk about other parts of the world as well that Rastafari have been persecuted. And Rastafari is a very anti-systematic movement, and it was really about, you know, breaking away from the oppressive colonial white supremacist system that existed in Jamaica at the time. And you know what, the colonial government, they didn't want these freed Africans, you know what, or three, you know, to think differently and you know, start to do for himself and unite. So they tried to suppress the movement from the very inception. As I mentioned earlier, Leonard Howell, who's, you know, accredited being the founder of Rastafari, he went in prison. He was arrested in prison several times. He was put in prison for sedition, and they didn't like the fact that what Rastafari was bringing forth and the potential that they could see, you know, for the masses of Black people to, you know, to rise up against the system. And in terms of the persecution against Rastafari, there's been persecution for different reasons, but it's been constant since the inception, and it's been bad. So you've had reasons such as, you know what, the colonial system, you know what, wanting to suppress this Afrocentric pro-Black movement. Then you have the ganja. Now, something that's very important. Not every Rasta smokes ganja. Yeah, you don't have to smoke ganja to be a Rasta, but a lot of people have been persecuted for ganja, whether they smoke ganja or not. Yeah, and that was certainly in Jamaica at a time. For example, there was a lot of innocent Rastas, for example, who were taken to prison, or, you know, laws were then put in place, for example, and a lot of Rastas were persecuted for ganja, and then also a lot of Rastas who didn't smoke ganja were put in the same kind of paintbrush. So you had Rastas who went to prison that didn't, or got charges against them that wasn't even smoking ganja or didn't have possession of it. So this is another reason. Then you have, you know, a prejudice against Rastafari by people of the Christian faith, because many people in Jamaica is a Christian country, and you know, the majority of people in Jamaica are Christians, and they've had a very negative attitude towards Rastafari. And I think maybe that's part of another spirituality that's come across, and maybe they wanted to not necessarily just hold their values, but the fact is that they've been very hostile to Rastafari. I mean, one of the elders that I spoke to, he told me when he was growing up in Jamaica, he grew up with the Christian telling the Rasta man, "You're going to burn in hell." And it was a lot of the Christians and the church that really hit out against Rastafari and put them down, and a lot of the discrimination was coming from the church or people in that kind of Christian mindset that couldn't see the light that Rastafari was trying to bring forth in terms of liberation and bringing a level of consciousness in our people. So you have the persecution in that level as well. So and then there's people that don't understand it, so misconceptions about it, which is why I've written the book. So people don't understand it, they just see, oh, why you say Selassie, these people thinking that Selassie is God in this, or why are these people worshipping the man, or not that everyone sees Selassie as God, but I'm just saying this as an example, and people just not understanding and getting what it is, and then people thinking it's like, when they just see people that, have locks and smoke ganja and not have any purposeful, associating that with it, yeah. Like, I'm in the Gambia here, and people just look at Rastas, at these people on the streets like bumpsters, what they call bumpsters here, people on the streets don't have purpose. But people not seeing beyond that because they don't have the knowledge or the education about what the movement is. So sometimes ignorance that has also brought that through as well. But it was in a time, it was just so heavily colonized in Jamaica that anything, anti-systematic or tackling the status quo, people's minds were just trained or sorted in a certain way. So when they look at this kind of movement, and when Howell was saying certain things, about the Queen of England and the King of England, and Black people united and doing this kind of things, it was like, whoa, look at these people there, they're saying this, that, and the other. People at that time, now people are starting to get it and come to pass. Our consciousness has changes. But at that time, for example, what they were saying, the Rastas, it was revolutionary, and the majority of Black people were just not at that level. They were still in a colonized mindset. Yeah. So the persecution over the years of Rasta, examples of this now is that you had, as I mentioned, Leonard Howell, who went to prison several times. Well, not just Howell, you also have other founders of the Rasta movement, such as Joseph Hibbert, Robert Hines, Archibald Dunkley. They were all put in prison and went in prison for durations. You had Pinnacle. Pinnacle was the most established self-sufficient community in Jamaica between 1941 and 1958, and it housed thousands of Rastafarians, and they farmed, there were skilled workers, and these people, they had money, they banked their own money in Pinnacle, and it was a prospering community. Yeah. But Pinnacle was raided several times by the colonial government of Jamaica, who couldn't stand the fact that you had this sovereign it was like a nation within a nation thriving in colonial Jamaica. You had an incident in 1963, and that colonial government that led to the demise of Pinnacle, and through the raids. It was raided in 1958, but a lot of occupants dispersed. If not 1958, 1955, there was a big raid. If a lot of occupants that dispersed in 1955, and then a lot of the remaining ones left in 1958. But what you have in 1963 was an incident called the Coral Gardens Massacre, where the Prime Minister at the time was called Sir Alexander Bustamante. And there's an incident that happened in Montego Bay Coral Gardens involving, it was basically a land dispute. And following the land dispute, a group of Rastafarians, Franklin Rudolph was shot over a dispute over land by the police. Franklin Rudolph was a Rastafarian who was shot by the police, and he wanted to seek revenge for the fact that he was shot by the person who he had the land dispute with. So he went to the person's petrol station with some of his associates, and they burnt down the petrol station. Later on, within the next day, 7 people were killed as a result of that, not by Franklin Rudolph, by when the police sent out their search, etc. And what then happened as a result of that? Now, bearing in mind, these actions didn't happen because he was a Rastafarian doing this, yeah, or his associates were Rastafarian. Even though he was shot by the police, his actions in revenge wasn't because of that. But the Prime Minister sent out a verdict after that to bring all Rastas in, dead or alive. Now, when he says bring them in dead or alive, it means bring them into prison, dead or alive. And then he went on to say, if the prison can't hold them, throw them in a cemetery. Yeah, that means to kill them. Yeah, if the prison can't hold them, throw them on Bogle. Bogle is a cemetery in Jamaica. And we've got eyewitness accounts. I've got recordings. I've listened to elders say this, I've got recordings where they said that they was there in in prison in front of Bustamante getting beaten up, the government, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and Bustamante said, if I don't kill out all the Rastas in Jamaica, God must blind me. Yeah. So this is genocide attempt. When you look at Rastas were rounded up, beaten up, they were called beds. A lot of the time when it was reported in the Jamaican Gleaner, it was referred to as bedsmen, because a lot of Rastas didn't have locks then. Some did, but some still didn't. Some of them still had, just beds, and that's how they were identified with. But many of them, and even though it was in Coral Gardens, it also other parts of the island, Rastas were also persecuted during that period. And during a period of a few days, not just the police were brutalizing Rasta, but members of the public jumped in as well. And if Rasta was, Rastas were beaten up, some of them were taken to prison, some of them were murdered, some of their families were displaced. And this kind of atrocity and shows how much Bustamante hated, but it also shows, a lot of like the society in general, what they thought of Rastafari, because it was common for Rastas to be walking on the streets. And if they had locks on, people would take a glass bottle, cut off their locks. Yeah, Rastas couldn't walk in certain streets; they had to go in the gullies, and that led to a lot of Rastas, having to go and live up in the hills. And even before Rastas that had locks, it was like they were still persecuted. As I mentioned, how not only was he put in prison, he was also put in a mental asylum because the authorities claimed he was a madman. And these are some of the atrocities that Rastas gone through outside of Jamaica, because this is mainly concentrated on Jamaica now. But in Dominica, you had something called the dread law, which meant that if you saw a man who locks, which is what they identified as Rastafarian, not to say that all people that have locks are Rasta, but basically it was to say Rastafarian. So if you saw a Rasta man with locks, it was legal for you to shoot that person on sight. Wow. Yeah. Basically, so let's say it's illegal for you to kill a Rasta man. In Dominica, even in England, yeah, where a lot of our parents or grandparents immigrated from the Windrush generation and came to England, yeah, from like the 1948 to the 1970s. When their children in the 70s, there was a big rise up of Rastafari popularity in England, and their own children they threw out on the streets a lot of time because they turned Rasta, because they were prejudiced against Rasta, because again the colonial mind that reigned in the people. A lot of it was some of it was to do with the fact that they were Christians and they couldn't take any other spirituality or faith out of it. But then a lot of it was just not even to do with Christian. It was just that because they just didn't like Rastafari for all these kinds of some of the reasons I mentioned before. They just had some prejudice against Rastafari about understanding what it is. But the reality is that Rastas were thrown out, as many of the teenagers, onto the street. And this was a racist, British, Britain is still racist, but particularly back then, a very hostile racist society where you had, white people that used to attack people on the streets on a regular basis. So you're throwing out your own children into this environment. I remember speaking to a Rasta elder, and he told me that when he come to Jamaica and he told his father he was a Rasta, and he was like his dad beat him up and said that, this is what they do to Rastas in Jamaica, beat him up and threw him out the house. Yeah. Wow. And that man later on got arrested. I don't know for whatever reason, but he said he got arrested when he was arrested, he was put in prison and they trimmed off his hair, and he still got a part in his hair, a patch that doesn't grow back properly from the way that the police trimmed him, because they never just did no fancy trim like you go to the barber shop. It was This is just some of the persecution. There's more, but these are just some of the way that Rastas have been persecuted over the years,
Wow, that's quite terrible. When I read about the persecution of the Rastafarian, I was quite shocked with it. I was like, how would people behave this way? Now, I also want to ask you about this. Do you agree with Leonard Howell's idea of Christianity as being a white man's doctrine to make the black subjective to them? This is one of the many facts that made me find your book, The Rise of Rastafari, quite argumentative. You bibliographically wrote from Howell's book, The Promise Key, that the white man's doctrine, that's Christianity, has forced the black man to forsake silver and gold and seek heaven after death. Then it also goes further and say that it has brought us to live in disgrace and die in dishonor. Now, we, the black, have found out that their doctrine was only a trick and all the intention to make themselves strong. And for the black, in my opinion, I think Howell is just a man like you and I. Do you not think that he's been, racist himself towards the right to have said that? Don't you think he has probably written that, based on his own personal prejudice? Or what do you think of the citation?
I think there's a lot of elements we're going to tackle here now. Let me racism, and you're alluding to, I think, that racism and prejudice, and then I'm going to talk about whether Christianity is a white man's doctrine. So just pull me up on that, for example, if I need to, after when I talk about racism and prejudice, in case I move on. But in terms of the latter part of what you said, in terms of I think you need to look at the context of the environment at the time. Like I've mentioned, you've read my book, The Rise of Rastafari, so you know what happened, transatlantic slavery and the colonial years. And just so the readers can get insight, if they haven't read the book, or in case they don't know, because I know you have people from all over the world. I'm just going to read something from the book, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation, which is actually in a revised edition. I mentioned I've got a revised edition. I'm just going to read a part, which is on page 46 of that book. And this is something now which comes from Leonard Howell on The Rise of Rastafari, which is another book which I've quoted in this. Yeah. So let me just read it, and then I'm going to put into context what you said.
Okay.
On page 169 of the first Rasta, Leonard Howell and the Rise of Rastafarianism. Blade Howell stated that his father, Leonard Howell, Blade Howell is the son of Leonard Howell, hit out against the thought of white superiority and black inferiority that was common at the time. Blade said one of his, Leonard Howell's, first tenets was that the black man is as good as the white man and made his contributions to the world just as the white man had. But his philosophy was ridiculed. In the 19th century, when my father was born, the black man was always the last in line. He was almost non-human. Daddy, this is what my brother and me called him, did not like this. The black man is just as important and just as talented as the white man. In those days, such a statement was revolutionary. And the reason why I said that is because again, we're talking about the context of the time, where you're talking about a time, just like you said, that the black man was almost non-human, stated from Blade Howell. And you know what? White superiority and black inferiority was run rampant in the society. So what Leonard Howell was doing is he's a reactionary to white racism. Yeah, he's not necessarily a racist. It's like, for example, let's just say, and I think we have an issue with this as a whole. Let's say, you've done something to me, for example, and or your family or your community, and then I then get angry at you. Yeah. And then instead of dealing with you as a person who's done the wrong or the bad thing, you're then addressing me for being angry with something that you've done. Yeah, and I think this is like a similarity in terms of this situation here. Leonard Howell is talking about, let's just call it what it is. It's talking about white people and the ill treatment that white people have done towards black people. And Christianity has been used as a tool, to certainly in the context where Howell was talking about, to oppress black people. But he's talking about basically the ill treatment that has happened at the hands of black people against white people, and he's standing up, not just in this statement, but in general. He's been someone to stand up and say, and courageous, and be, look, this is wrong. The way that white people have treated black people, and I don't like white people because of these reasons. It's not like he's just saying it out of like he's got justified reasons because of the environment and the oppression put under black people at that period of time. So so I don't think we can really say that he's done it because of his own racism and his own prejudice. I think that's basically almost like turning and excusing, being a bit apologetic to white people and then putting the foot on the other on the shoe, because Leonard Howell never oppressed no white people. Leonard Howell never, his ancestors never enslaved people. So I think sometimes as a people, we take a bit of an apologetic stance, and it's like, for example, if you say you don't like something that white people do, or you don't like, and I use this because this could even go beyond color, but I'm using this as an example because I think this is a kind of it's relevant to what we're talking about. If you're saying that, I don't like the way black people have been treated by white people, for example, and I'm saying not all white people, by the way, because it's not all, but I'm saying by certain white people, yeah, and then you have a problem with that, you're then called racist. Yeah, for saying that you don't like the treatment and saying this is wrong. So I think that really needs to change, and I think we have that complex with our people a lot. But going back now into Christianity and the so-called the white man's religion or doctrine, and when Howell was referring to it and looking at that quote, is the way that Christianity was passed on to people at that time was through the white man. Now, Christianity, and I want to be clear, and rudiments of Christianity, and it's not to say it didn't start, during slavery, Christianity, it didn't necessarily exist in the name of Christianity, centuries and thousands of years ago, but certainly the Bible and scripture, was predate slavery, and the origins of what scripture and Bible and things that the Bible comes from, for example, it was around for centuries, and some of the influence of the Bible, like the mythology, dates to you can even say the laws of Mahat, the 42 laws, like where it says thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not this, and then you have like the 10 commandments. But a lot of the mythology in scripture or existed in parts of Africa, before slavery, so that is not deniable. I think something Haile Selassie said that Ethiopia's got one of the oldest copies of the Bible, however, Christianity, as we know it today, and the way that it's been brought upon us, certainly during slavery, is a white man's doctrine. It's a Europeanized way. And what you often look at is when a lot of the slaves, for example, the enslaved Africans, a lot of the enslaved Africans came to the Caribbean. Christianity, they wasn't Christians when they came to the Caribbean. So just like how language, culture, and these slaves I mentioned earlier, they were seasoned to look at things a certain perspective. One of the things that the slave masters and overseers used to keep the slaves as submissive, and that was imposed on them, was Christianity. I've been to universities where I've had a white lecturer, a university lecturer, that told me about the way that Christianity is imposed on black people by white people during slavery. So I'm not just saying it because I'm a black man that's angry about slavery or this, that, and the other, but I'm saying the way that it's being seen today in terms of how it was passed on during slavery, and because the Africans, Christianity didn't exist in Africa in the way that it exists today until the colonial years, the European colonial years. That's not to say it wasn't in certain parts of Africa and it didn't exist, but it didn't exist in the way that it exists, and it wasn't the popularization of Christianity wasn't how we see it today. So when you look at like the imagery of Christianity, say a white Jesus Christ that is often portrayed, for example, these are examples of, again, they say the way that I think Leonard Howell was alluding to, how it's a white man's doctrine and a Europeanization of Christianity, so as an example. So when you look at the fact that how Christianity was put upon black people and used to keep black people submissive, and then the imagery of this white Christ, all that I've mentioned, for example, and these are some of the reasons why Leonard Howell alluded to it, is the way how Christianity got to those people, Africans in the Caribbean. So also when you're talking about forsaking silver and gold and seeking life in heaven, something that Christianity also taught, something that also not Christianity taught, but something which has always been basically put into the minds of our people, was that regardless of whatever happens on the plantation, or even after into the colonial years in Jamaica, that we'll get our reward in heaven, and don't worry now, we don't have to worry about working now because our reward is in heaven. Everyone else is seeking their reward now, whether it's white people or Asian. Christianity has been used but as a tool by white people, basically, to advance themselves as a people, whether it's to help carry out their colonial conquest, not just through transatlantic slave trade, but even when you look at, say, in the Congo, as an example, when the King Leopold and they set all the atrocities in the Congo, it was the Christian missionaries that went in there first. And a lot of these colonial conquests and these invasions happened. A lot of Christian Christianity has then been put into, to induced into the minds of the people. So when you're talking about religion, or particularly Christianity, because I don't want to go too much in Islam as well, but Christianity, you're talking about something, a religion that had been used and put into a Eurocentric perspective, where we start to denigrate things African as well, and look down on things African because that are not in line with the Bible. And when most black people think about Christianity, recently now people are starting to see it a bit more like before, say in the Afrocentric view, but certainly back then black people's image of God was, or image of divinity was a white man called Christ, and they couldn't see anything black in the Bible, even though in the Bible, these places, there are places in the Bible like Ethiopia, which clearly state that
in the Bible.
Yeah, which clearly state that, but the average black person at the time couldn't see, the average Christian couldn't see nothing, no connection between, the Bible and Africa, or no connection between blackness. So this is the kind of reasons why he's saying that it's a white man's doctrine. And like I said before, it was to stop black people from, trying to rise up and resist, to say, things are wrong and we should try to do things and make things better today, now. Seek instead of our pie in the sky in centuries down the line, which may or not necessarily happen. But Christianity, when the way that Europeans have done it, they've Europeanized it in a way to suit their own benefit.
Okay. I would have loved to move more further and deeper into this question, because as you were speaking, there are some questions that came to my mind, but I just love to skip them for now because of our time. Now, I'd love to move to the next question. Another key fact in your book, The Rise of Rastafari, is the emergence of Rastafari and Leonard Howell, who we just finished talking about. Now, without giving much information away, could you tell us about Leonard Howell's influence on the Rastafari movement?
Yeah, well, Leonard Howell was the pioneer for the Rasta movement. So he's known as the first Rasta. And you have Joseph Hibbert, Robert Hines, Archibald Dunkley, Leonard Howell. And then, out of the four most popular founders, of the Rastafarian movement, Leonard Howell was the most prominent one. Yeah. And he's the one that, that popularized it the most out of them. And Leonard Howell was a visionary. In my personal opinion, should be a Jamaican national hero. He was he had a close relationship with Marcus Garvey. He was heavily influenced by Garvey's teachings of which are a lot in line in terms of unification of black people, race first, black people coming together, and black love and doing for self, just like we see other races of groups of people doing. And he strongly opposed the worship that black people had for as I said, this white image of Christ, and tried to steer black people away from Christianity. And also he was very adamant because he believed that the Christian clergies he called them thieves, and he believed that again it had been used as a religion to keep black people submissive. But away from that now, and let's talk about other things about how. So even he rejected the colonial system completely, and he taught that black people shouldn't pay taxes to King George, and he really rejected the fact that black people should look up to King George as the British monarchy, and he said that black people should start looking and praise to Emperor Haile Selassie, who was a black king in Ethiopia. And how we created this concept of Haile Selassie as a god and king. Now, Haile Selassie was the emperor of Ethiopia, so he was a king, but he saw the need in a colonial environment in Jamaica for black people to have their own sense of spirituality, which is embedded in their own history, culture, and for them to see divinity within ourselves, because who you look towards as your king or your heroes or martyrs, etc., says a lot in terms of your psychology as a person. So I think one of the areas that he was saying that we shouldn't look to a white Christ, we should look at Selassie as a black and see divinity within ourselves, because if you look at, say, an image of God that isn't like you, and say like a white man and you're of another ethnicity, people are thinking all white people are godly, for example, and it really gets into your subconscious that and people started to see themselves in an inferior light. So he saw that the importance for black people to have to look at have a king or have a god in our own image, just like how white people have Eurocentrized Christianity, so they've got a white image of Christ, just like how you see in Asian people that have they've got their their own image of how they in terms of Islam, how they basically it's linked with their own kind of culture and history. But I think when we look at, say, Christianity, often it's our people don't they come into it at the expense of African history and denigrate. So not just Christianity, but religions in general. Yeah, I think when it's Islam or Christianity, we come into it, and a lot of times these are then we throw away with African culture, denigrate. Whereas other people, it enhances the culture. So he was saying that there was a need for us to create this movement based on our own experience, and for us to, in terms of reconnecting with Africa. Because one of the main pillars and principles of Rastafari is repatriation, and repatriation at the cornerstone of it. Marcus Garvey, he wasn't a Rasta, but the Garvey movement and is heavily about the back to Africa. Although Garvey didn't repatriate, or Howell didn't repatriate himself, but that was the intention, and it was basically to say under oppression and of racism, discrimination in the Western world, and we have a memory of Africa, and in terms of when Haile Selassie was crowned, it brought back a memory that some of us. It was to say that we can look to ourselves in a more positive light. And look to ourselves as gods, as kings and queens, instead of looking at ourselves as inferior people, as slaves and a second-class citizen, which is the way that Black people had been persecuted and treated in the Western world. So the call for repatriation is one of the, as I said before, I can't stress how important this is to the Rastafarian movement. And I think even for those that are in the diaspora, I think there's always going to be something missing if you're not fully connected onto the continent. So I think really every Rastafari should at least try to go to Africa, even if they're not living there. So that is what they were striving for, and the aim of how it was the on the raising the consciousness and the minds of our people out of colonialism. Yeah, so it was to basically to rid the messages of our mind of colonialism and white supremacy, and for Black people to be proud of self, to look at reconnecting with our history, and to go back home. Africa is our homeland. That's the place that we were taken away from the Western world, 300, 400, 500 years ago now, and it was really about the call to rally around home, and that's something that the reason why Howell they wasn't able to get home is that they had intentions to, but there was as I said, so much persecution by the colonial government, and then other Rastas by their family, by this, that, and the other, and this is what stifled a lot of the Rastas from actually. Some have made it home, repatriated to Africa, like myself, but this is what stifled and stopped a lot of the early Rastas from repatriating. But this is some insight. Leonard Howell built Pinnacle. Pinnacle was the most self-sufficient community in Jamaica, I mentioned earlier, between 1941 and 1958, and he used to give out money to poor people that were suffering in the street. So he did a lot of what he was really a freedom fighter for the people of Jamaica, and he went into court and said, no, the King of England, he's not my king. He's like, I praise His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie. So he was an advocate, like I mentioned earlier from the quote from Leonard Howell, that the Black man is just as good as the white man, and we've got a history which is just as rich, and about defending, the rights of Black people in colonial Jamaica. Just a bit of an insight about, the person, Leonard Howell, the man.
Wow, I love the sound of that. Thanks for adding that to the answer. And I think I would love to take a break on Makonnen Sankofa, on Rastafari. We'll catch you up later. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hi there, viewers. Today, I'm joining in conversation with Makonnen Sankofa, the author of Life in Gambia, the Smiling Coast of Africa, and he's also the author of The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation. It's a pleasure to have Mr. Makonnen on the show. Hi there, Makonnen Sankofa.
Yes, I'm here from the beautiful smiling coast of Africa known as the Gambia. Thanks for having me on your show, Peter.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Oh, Makonnen, tell us about Pan-Africanism and the sort of connection that Pan-Africanism have with your books, The Rise of Rastafari and maybe Life in Gambia.
Okay, so let's start with Pan-Africanism in connection to Rastafari book. And I want to tell you what Pan-Africanism is, because Pan-Africanism is abroad and people's perspective of what they call Pan-Africanism can differ. But, I define Pan-Africanism as people of African heritage, for example, putting their differences aside for the empowerment of people of African heritage. And that could be, politically, spiritually, culturally, socially, in various different ways. But, it's about people of African heritage uniting for the empowerment and advancement of our people. And that's why it's quite broad, because that can lead to then many different things. The reason why Pan-Africanism links into Rastafari, because Rastafari is a form of Pan-Africanism. You don't have to be a Pan-Africanist to be a Rastafari, but to be a Rastafari, you have to be a Pan-Africanist. Yeah, because the movement stems from that ideology of, people of African heritage advancing. And, the concept of Pan-Africanism, a lot of it does come from the diaspora, because obviously during, slavery, or even to this day in the Western world, when, you're put in the same kind of bracket, like in terms of, as long as you're black or your person of color, you're shifted into that bracket. Whereas we know the continent is different. It's like a man in Gambia doesn't necessarily know about East Africa, or it's more tribal. Yeah, and so what I'm saying is Pan-Africanism is the importance, because of basically a lot of people in the diaspora being put into that kind of bracket, and a lot of when enslaved Africans were taken, they weren't taken they were taken from different countries and put on ships, for example. And even in the diaspora, you have, say in England, you have people from Ghana, people from Nigeria, you have people from all over Africa. It's not just one part of Africa, but then you're still treated in a certain way by the society in general and put in a bracket. You're not Caribbean, not African. You're just then seen, particularly to the general, the white racist society, is just, oh, you're black, and you're put in that kind of bracket. So it's something that basically saying that we're being discriminated, or we have been oppressed because of not because we're Gambian, not because we're Ghana before these countries even exist, not because the fact is that when you're looking at the way that we've been discriminated, because we're people of African Caribbean, because of our complexion, whether it's light brown to dark black, basically we've just been put in one category. You're black, not you're Nigerian, not you're this part of Africa, you're that part of the Caribbean. And the common struggles of the descendants of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and in the Western world, but then also on the continent as well. And the reason we've been basically it's happened a lot because of the race, because of the skin complexion. So to say that we need to put those differences aside, because we are different. Not all black people, we come in different complexions, we come in different tribes, we come in different cultures. We're not all one black people, we're all the same like that. But the fact is that we have got an experience, we have been, targeted because of, having a certain skin color, being of a certain ethnicity. So the need for us to then come together for our people, and particularly for Africa, but it could be in the West, but I'm saying concentrate on Africa to really, progress and advance. When you see the way that Africa has been colonized and split up into different countries, etc. And without going too far away now, going back into Rastafari and the significance of Pan-Africanism to Rastafari, is that the ideals in Rastafari are heavily based. The teachings, a lot of Rastafari comes from Garveyism, which Garveyism teachings are based on Pan-Africanism. Leonard Howell was very much about Pan-Africanism, and so were the people core to the inception of the movement. So Pan-Africanism is at the core, and because we didn't know what part of Africa we come from, we just look at the whole of Africa as one. So when you look at Rastafari, you have like Haile Selassie at the center part of the movement. He's an emperor in Ethiopia. You have a group like the Bobo Shanti, which is one of the groups of Rastafari. Now, many of the Shanti people were taken. The Shanti is a subgroup of the Akan people from Ghana, and a lot of the Akan people were taken to Jamaica during slavery. Some of them were marooned. Some of the people that resisted slavery, but many of them were taken to the Caribbean, Jamaica. And that's a connection, that Ashanti and Akan people have with Jamaica. And this is why you have some of the names like Nani, Akum, Achumpong, and these kind of names. These are Coromantee, what they call Caramanti. These are Ashanti, Akan names. So there's a connection there. So what the Bob Ashanti did was call a group, the Bob Ashanti. They believe that they're part of the lost Ashanti from Jamaica. You have the Nyabingi, which is another Rastafari group. Nyabingi is an order in Uganda, Rwanda, that resist a movement that rise up to resist colonialism. And at the head of Nyabingi is a queen called Queen Mahanusa, also known as Queen Nyabingi, who was a warrior queen. So that Rastafari group was named Nyabingi after Empress Nyabingi from Uganda, Rwanda. You have, the drumming, the African, the drumming, and as well. So these are some things of, how different elements of Africa have influenced, the Rastafari movement. In terms of Gambia now, we have my second book,
okay,
which is Life in Gambia, the Smiling Coast of Africa. So this is effectively, my experience of being on the continent, but in terms of Pan-Africanism, when I was in Gambia, I did meet certain individuals that I had conversations with, that I mentioned in my book, that also shared, a Pan-African outlook and a Pan-African mindset. I think the reality, though, on the continent, just like I mentioned earlier, for example, is not everyone, though, in the Gambia, because sometimes people in Gambia, they don't know what other countries are in other parts of Africa. So they're looking more in towards, Gambia, or even their tribe, like the Wolof, the Mandinka. So that's something that I noticed and I had to deal with, slightly different. And then I've become more aware of that as I've got more experience on the continent, for example. And that's why I said this Pan-Africanism idea is really something that even I'm Pan-Africans that emerged really on the diaspora. Like even like some of the Pan-African leaders, like you say, like Nkrumah, he had to go to, London or whatever, then find out about Pan-Africanism and come back onto the continent. Yeah. Garvey, it has influenced Africa as a whole. The flag of Malawi is based on Marcus Garvey's colors. So, for example, it's really more about an ideology from the diaspora. So, not everyone on the continent quite gets the idea of, Pan-Africanism for those various different reasons. But, for me, I said I see all Africa as home. So as a Pan-Africanist, so for me, even though my parents are not necessarily from Gambia, but I think getting the experience of Africa has certainly broadened my horizons on certain things.
Wow, that's great. I love your deep and extensive answer to that question. And this will make me to ask you the last question that I got in this section, Makonnen Sankofa, on Rastafari and Pan-Africanism. Now, could you tell us about Marcus Garvey and its link with the Rastafarians?
Yeah, so Marcus Garvey had an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. Oh. And that organization had millions of Black people from all over the world, in different parts of the world, some in the Caribbean, some in the United States, the other parts of the Americas, England. It still exists to this day. It's not as powerful as it used to be, but the UNIA still exists. And they had, hotels, steam laundry shops, restaurants, businesses. And Garvey was a Pan-Africanist activist. That's what he's known of. It was the largest race first movement, and probably arguably the most significant, African leader in the diaspora in the 20th century, in the 19th, 20th century. Wow. And the reason why he's significant to Rastafari, because a lot of his teachings of, race first, of Black unity, self-determination, nation building, which is, the main, these are the main things, quintessential Garveyism, and then Black people looking at divinity within ourselves. These are very much in line with the teachings of Rasta. All of the early founders of Rastafari and followers, they were Garveyites. They were, coming from Marcus Garvey's organization. And Leonard Howell says it was a close friend of Marcus Garvey. And there was a time where Garvey, he was advocating, the importance and the need, for Black people to look at spirituality from an African, from a Black perspective. He was saying that, in fact, there's actually, let me find the quote, because there's actually a couple of quotes in my book from Marcus Garvey that I've referred to. So just bear with me.
I think that should be starting from page 21. That's where you talked about post-slavery and Garvey.
Yeah, so Garvey, he taught that black people should view God in their own image. And in page 24 of the Rise of Rastafari, it's the original edition of the Rise of Rastafari I'm looking at now.
Oh.
On page 24, I've used a reference of page 44 of the book, The Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey stated, if the white man has the idea of a white God, let him worship his God as he desires. If the yellow man's God is of his race, let him worship his God as he sees fit. We as Negroes have found a new ideal. Whilst our God has no color, yet it is human to see everything through one's own spectacles. And since the white men have seen their God through white spectacles, we have only now started out, late though it be, to see our God through our own spectacles. The God of Isaac, the race that believe in the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. We Negroes believe in the God of Ethiopia, the everlasting God, the one God we believe, but we shall worship him through the spectacles of Ethiopia. Yeah. So the need of black people had seen the image of God, and 184 of the selected writings and speeches of Marcus Garvey. There is a reprint of an article, Marcus Garvey, which was originally published in the Negro World newspaper in 1925. And in the article, Garvey said, the time has come for the Negro to forget and cast behind him his hero worship, to start immediately to create and emulate heroes of his saints, create our own martyrs, and elevate positions of fame and honor black men and women who have made their distinct contributions to our racial history. So this, along with other statements that Marcus Garvey, now some people question whether Garvey said this or not, but there was a speech, it's claimed in 1927, that Marcus Garvey uttered, looked at Africa for the crowning of a black king, he shall be a redeemer. Now, Reverend Morris Webb is someone, a reverend who's I believe there's an article or he stated in a speech, people reiterated that and later on said it, or whether it's debatable whether or not he said that, Marcus Garvey. Even if he did say that, Reverend Webb stated that before that, but again, he's reiterating the need for black people to look within ourselves. But what he did do, Marcus Garvey, there was a play in Jamaica in 1930, and in that play there was a coronation of an African king, yeah. And in that play in 1930, there was words to the effect of, look to Africa for the crowning of a black king. He shall be the redeemer. Something along those lines. And those words were stated in that play. And now shortly after that, in 1930, in November the 2nd, 1930, His Imperial Majesty became the king, the emperor. So he was king previously, but he became the emperor of Ethiopia. So this is the kind of significance to Garvey to the Rastafarian movement. He's seen by many as a prophet in the Rastafarian movement, who brought forth the revelation. Even though he was a Christian, he wasn't a Rastafarian, but he understood the need for black people to see an image of divinity within himself.
Wow, that's fantastic. I so much appreciate your deep and extensive answers to this question. And I think I would love to take a break on Makonnen Sankofa, on Rastafari and Pan-Africanism. We'll catch you up later. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Makonnen Sankofa is the author of the best-selling book, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation, and also the author of Life in Gambia, all of which I've left a link in the description part of this interviews for viewers who would like to get a copy from Amazon. There is much to know about Mr. Makonnen Sankofa, ranging from being a journalist to an entrepreneur, an educator, public speaker, community activist, etc. What you had, get to know him better as we proceed in the interview. Welcome on the show, Marcona.
Thank you very much, Peter, for having me. It's great to be on the show with you today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Likewise.
Now, Makone, another critical themes that you expound in your book is the transatlantic slave trade, which can be found in page 14 of The Rise of Rastafari, where you wrote about how millions of Black Africans were kidnapped in the west coast of Africa by white Europeans, and how they were sold into slavery. I want to have your opinion about this. What connection do you think the transatlantic slave trade have over the dispersion of the Black community around the world today? How does this connect with Africans in diaspora? Would you say that the old slave trade is what led to what we have today as Black Americans and many other Black people found around Europe and other parts of the world?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is largely to do with it because, there are two things. Obviously, you have the dispersion of Africans because of slavery, transatlantic slave trade. As we know, slaves, descendants, no, let me say that again, enslaved Africans. I don't like saying African slaves because they were enslaved Africans. Yeah, and I think that's something that is very important that we say. So enslaved Africans were taken from parts of West Africa and sometimes Central Africa, like the Congo, but generally it's parts of West Africa, like, Ghana, Nigeria, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, and other countries along the west coast of Africa. And, then transported to places such as the Caribbean and the Americas, like USA, Brazil, etc. So that has led to the dispersion of Africans from the continent, because obviously when they've then gone to those countries, they've then had children, and that's led to the population of more Africans, and a lot of them have stayed in those countries for generations, and not necessarily come back. So that has led to why you have Africans all over the world. In terms of in Europe now, the reason why you have a large concentration of Africans in Europe, such as UK and other parts of Europe as well, but particularly UK, let me focus on England. Like my grandparents' generation, they immigrated from Jamaica, and then they went from Jamaica to the Caribbean. So in 1948, you had a mass migration of people of African heritage that was living in the Caribbean, Commonwealth countries, to come to to Britain to help build up the country because of the World War II, which happened, and Britain was in a very bad state because of World War II that happened. So these people from the Caribbean, these Africans in the Caribbean, were invited to come to Britain by Queen Elizabeth, and so many of them took the opportunity to come up because conditions. Living conditions in the Caribbean wasn't very good after slavery ended. The people were left kind of like with no compensation. Unlike the British slave holders, they were like, it was just basically, it's like you free a man, but you don't, because you don't give him anything for him to fend for himself or for him to survive. So they were just basically freed, but with no compensation. And then after that, into the colonial years, the environment and the condition of Jamaica, there wasn't a lot of opportunities and things to really for people to make the ends meet, for example, was very challenging, difficult. So a lot of people coming to Britain as England, particularly England, they thought it was the streets are paved with gold, and that had been propaganda had been played, and they came with high inspirations and thinking that for a better life that they would be able to do better in England than they were previously back home in the Caribbean. So a lot of them between 1948 up until like 1970, there's a mass migration of people from the Caribbean islands. I use Jamaica because that's where my grandparents came from, that came to the UK. So that's why you have a heavily concentration of people of Caribbean heritage in the UK, but then some of them also went to the United States. The United States had enslaved Africans that were directly there taken from the continent, but then you also had some of them that came from like the Caribbean, like particularly Jamaica. Some of them that came from Jamaica. Like my grandparents, some of us came to the UK, some of the family, but some of the other side of the family went to the United States. So it was like a mixture. So I've got family in USA and UK split, just like Canada as well. You have like a lot of Jamaican people in Canada, so some of them went to Canada. I've got family in Canada as well, so that's why you have like black people dispersed out in along the world. And then you have also the Africans now on the continent, which has been more in recent times, particularly like say in the UK, for example. I think it was more like in the 80s and the 90s, and now you're having more of an influx of people on the continent coming, to the UK, which makes up now the majority of more so than, ones from the Caribbean, because most of the Africans now that are coming to the UK are coming directly from the continent. So, and Africans on the continent as well, going to other parts of Europe, America, and etc. So, those are the reasons why you have the dispersion. So the transatlantic slave trade has played a heavy role in, a lot of the dispersion of people of African heritage. But you also have now a growing influx of people from the continent that are relocating to all other parts of the world.
Wow, that's quite great, because I realize and find out that a lot of people have a sort of a misconception about this, not trying to identify if most Black people are from the African heritage or from Africa generally. Now, I'd also love to ask you this question, because in your book, I read about the brutal experience that most African slaves undergone during the transatlantic slave trade. You wrote about how many people died on the ship due to bad condition, and how some women were raped by their masters, how many committed suicide by throwing themselves off the boat into the sea, and how many Africans who tried to fight back and defend themselves were killed, among several other gruesome experiences that the Black undergone in the hands of their cruel masters. Could you tell us more about these and how these incidents gruesomely influenced the Rastafarian and other Africans?
Well, how it influenced, like the Rastafarian and other Africans, is that the legacy that the transatlantic slave trade has left, in terms of after slavery ended, it wasn't like, slavery all of a sudden ended and then that's it, for example. There's still been, mental slavery and inferiority. And even in the societies afterwards, you had societies which were heavily racist towards Black people, whether in the Caribbean, in the United States of America. And, it kind of laid the framework for a lot of racism that happened then after that, for example. And even though, the shackles were taken off, so to speak, and etc., but there was still heavy slavery that existed. So it was like, the mental slavery was still there as well in the people, in terms of, the minds, because during slavery, people have been, effectively like washed away from their Africanness, basically Europeanized. They're given, new European names. Their culture had been stripped of them. The language they talk, instead of the African language, Europeanized language. So all of these are part of the legacy of slavery. And the way we look at Africa, until this day, people still look at Africa, a lot of people from the Caribbean, in a very negative way. And a lot of this kind of stems from slavery, and down to even like the family structures that we still struggle with today, particularly people of Caribbean heritage. In the past during slavery, that it was like the female that was very kind of elevated amongst the male, and it's like the male was always basically, the Black male, for example, was put down. And this is why you have incidences like butt breaking, where effectively a man was raped in front of his own family, and how certain things, the woman was elevated above the man, and that kind of thing has influenced a lot of families today. So there's various, I think, things in the minds of our people. Again, you talk about spirituality, you could say about how the kind of spirituality that our people have, the kind of the penalize the version of the Christianity that a lot of people that have still carried over from slavery. So these are some of the ways that the legacy has affected us today, and why the Rasta movement and Africans in general, but also the Rasta movement, because I said the Rasta movement is about freeing the minds of mental slavery, and from transatlantic slave trade, coming out of that, our people were not in the right place in terms of their mind and what they thought of. They had an inferiority complex because that had been taught into them, and they had no choice because the brutality of what they were going through. So this is like how the transatlantic slave trade is, has influenced African people as a whole, and the Rastafarian movement have tried to really, as much as possible, to raise the the consciousness levels and get our people to be proud to say that we've got a history beyond slavery, because in slavery they didn't want you to learn about anything African history or part of your culture, whatever. That was all basically thrown away. So these are some of the areas that I've mentioned. But in terms of the brutality, now slave obviously life was dreadful, was terrible. Enslaved Africans taken from the west coast of Africa and then brought to places like the Caribbeans and Americans, and they had a very hard life from the onset. I mean, from being captured to then being put on these ships with little room to move, changing it to each other, and they took enslaved Africans sometimes from different African countries, and sometimes they couldn't communicate with languages. But then the horrendous. Imagine being obviously on a slave ship with pretty little room to move for pretty much the whole day. In those kind of conditions. That's why a lot of people threw themselves off of the ship. People tried to revolt. Some people were killed in the revolts. I think Amistad was one of the popular revolts, but there was a lot of people that did revolt, or people that threw themselves off the ships because of it. And to go through that, being put in at the bottom of a ship deck in a kind of like for months. In inhumane conditions. And we've got even before that, we could talk about the dungeons, the slave dungeons that existed, or they call slave fortresses in like Ghana. If you go like Amina Castle and other castles in Ghana, and you look at these dungeons and these places that they held slaves for sometimes up to periods of 1 year, in these kind of conditions. And I'm in Gambia, the Life in Gambia. My book is called Life in Gambia, the Smiling Coast of Africa. This is the home of Kunta Kinte. Everyone's familiar with the TV series Roots. And I've been to Jufre in Alfreda, like the home of Kunta Kinte, where his village was, and when he was captured, and then where he was taken away, which is called James Island. Now it's called Kunta Kinte Island. And to see that, someone that they used to just hang people up, well, basically put people up, tie people up into that kind of area, that they would be there for such long extended periods of time. And it's really barbaric. And this is just, the first part of it. This is just, the journey going to the destination. And then, when they get to the destination, they brandishing with irons, had to not produce, had to work on producing on the cotton plantations, producing products such as sugarcane, and things like that. And if sometimes if they couldn't collect enough quota, for example, they could be beaten, they could be whipped by their masters, or for any reason that the slave master felt fit. Scientific experiments were done on South African heritage women without getting any anesthetics and stuff like that. People that tried to resist slavery, for example, were killed, some burnt alive, and all kinds of atrocities. Women were raped, for example, even if they were married or whatever. They had no choice. One of the master could just take a slave wife and do what he wants to do with the wife. So people being kept in shackles and chains, and it's horrific. It's such a sad thing to think that a group of people can do that, such pain on another group of people for such, and something like that can go on for such a long time. Is just it's very, very hard to swallow that.
Wow, it's terrible. When I actually read about the section of your book, it actually pulled me in, and I was like, wow, this is quite intriguing, and I was going to ask him about this. Now, I'd love to move into my other question. From reading your book, I see that you are an advocate of justice towards the way the Black people are being treated outside Africa. You know, talk about the racism, the discrimination, the segregation, degradation, and several other inhumane acts. You know, despite the ongoing condition of the Black people around some part of the world, it is a shocking reality that most people who still reside in Africa are desperately yearning in pursuit of a good life in Europe, just as we've seen during the illegal crossing over of some Africans to Europe on the Mediterranean Sea. You know, as a Black activist, what do you have to say about this adventurous journey of the Blacks? What imagery do you think this portrays of Africa by the white community?
Well, it doesn't portray a good image of Africa. It portrays the image that, you know what, people would think, well, why if they're crossing over, they must be crossing over because things are better in the land that they're crossing to. That's what the kind of assumption that people would jump to straight away. Because, you know, why would you be moving from one place to other place unless you possibly think you're going to have a better life? Or no one goes to another country or somewhere else unless they're going to think, you know, things are necessarily going to be better for them, unless you know they're running away from something, etc. But in general, you're moving from one place to another place for, you know, a better way of life. And I think a lot of those people that go in the back way, that's why they are trying to go through the back way, because they believe, not necessarily it's true, but they believe that a better life is in Europe and the Western world. And unfortunately, the way Africa how it is in today is a lot of, you know, as we know, the natural resources have been exploited. Colonialism had a heavy effect on the continent, and it's changed, you know what, basically effectively it's made the continent what it is today. It's kept the continent reliant. So sometimes when people look at Africa and they say, well, how comes Africa is not prospering, this, that, and the other? You have to understand that the effects that colonialism has had on the continent, and in the minds of our people as well, for example, in the sense of, you know, we can't do for self. We always have to look towards Europe and the West as the best, and the fact is that's the kind of impact that it's had. And on an example on the ground now, not just in the minds, but, you know, in terms of I think there's about 14 francophone countries in Africa, and they're all paying still, you know, money to the French government for being colonized. It's called colonial debt. I mean, the French went in. The French were not the only, because we know England, Belgium, other countries did. But I'm using this as an example because a lot of people don't know this, but the French colonized Africa, countries like Togo, Senegal, you know, francophone speaking countries. That was colonized, and Guinea-Bissau, Burkina Faso, and they effectively said that when they was going to leave, that, you know, they so-called believed that they made improvements on these countries by colonialism and building infrastructure. And they said that, you know, if we're going to leave, we're going to mess up all the infrastructure in the country unless these taxes are, unless money is paid to us. So you have a result where African countries, Francophone countries, are paying billions amount of 500 billion every single year goes into the central bank. And this is the things, and African leaders that have tried to rise up against this and say, no, we're not doing this, this is wrong. Yeah, I think there was an example of one country where the country was completely, like, turned apart when basically by the French, when they said, no, we're not going to do this. And other instances, those leaders have been assassinated, basically, that haven't basically said that, you know what, we're going to do away with this colonial tax. So when people ask, you know, and people say, you know what, you know, why is Africa and why are people going abroad or whatever, people don't understand the kind of things that are done by the Western world to keep Africa in the state they're in. And this is a colonial tax, is the prime example. 500 billion, you know what, a year going to, you know, in a central franc bank. What that does, you know, we need to understand how that affects the economies of those countries from developing. And so the fact is that and they only have a certain budget that they can spend as well. If they want to get more money, they've got to go to the French to get more money, and then they've got to pay back high interest loans. So these are the kind of things like resources and military. They basically they still existing in neo-colonialism. They've got like allegiance to the France, So for, you know, if they're going to do like trade contracts, etc. So when you exist in that kind of colonial state, it keeps you at a certain level. When we've had African leaders, strong that have tried to, and this is outside of francophone countries now in general, when you've had strong African leaders that have tried to rise up, look at what has happened to them. We could talk about, we'll talk about the questionality of these leaders, because some people will say, well, yes, whether they're not or not. But I'm saying to you, you could say Gaddafi, you could say Nkrumah, you could say Mugabe, you could say Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba. There's a list of African leaders, right? When they have tried to do things for the continent, for our people, to advance our people, look what has been put against them. Oftentimes they've been assassinated or they've been attacked in some kind of way. And these are the things that have kept the continent from progressing. Look at Honorable Robert Mugabe. As soon as he basically said that, in Zimbabwe that it was going to allow the black people to take back the land, all of a sudden these sanctions are placed on Zimbabwe. For example, which affected the economy of the country. But and sometimes, because our people on the continent are not always fully sometimes educated on global affairs and world affairs, they just see things. Why is it that all of a sudden it's their problem, because they treat the white people off the farm. These people in Africa don't know what they're doing, but they're not understanding how how basically Zimbabweans, in terms of doing trade, in terms of how all of the sanctions basically affected that country. The fact that, for example, their credit was frozen. Can you imagine, if America is a country that runs off of credit, imagine if America, had credit frozen. Imagine if America couldn't trade with certain countries. So we need to understand, but there's a lot of IMF loans and money from the World Bank that come with stipulation, these NGOs going into Africa. And these are all the kind of issues that make Africa where it is today and the problem. So Africa is still in a colonial state. It's in a neo-colonial state where, the colonizers have left the continent, but, they've left things in places where it's still working for them. It's still working for Europe. It's still working for the West. And then they put in a lot of puppet leaders that do the bidding for them. And then when you have a leader that tries to rise above it and do for their own people, they often get taken out. So that makes, but the average person trying to, thinking about survival, the average African on the ground, and I'm in Gambia, is just thinking, what about African leaders? Why comes we can't do this, that, and the other? But Europe looks nice because I've got family and I see on TV, it looks nice and it looks like all of this. And when they come over there on holiday, it looks all nice. But they're not seeing the reason why Africa is in the condition today because of Europeans. But they have more of more of a thankful mind. And I see the way that they treat a lot of African countries, how they treat white people in African countries. So it's almost like not seeing that the resources and everything has been ripped and exploited out of Africa to make Europe what it is. But the average everyday African doesn't have that kind of access to information, or is not necessarily educated on the problems that Africa exists. So, but naturally, if you're in a country of survival and there is opportunities, and I'm not saying things are not all rosy. There is. I'm in the Gambia. There is some levels of poverty here, and you have poverty in everywhere, in every country in the world. And I get the logical thing is then you want to move to somewhere where you think it's in a better environment. So I get that. Not necessarily saying going the back way is not the right way to go about it, but I get that. But we also, but I'm just want to respond and say this is the the mindset of why a lot of people that are aspiring to Europe, because they see Europe as the streets are paved with gold, and they have this image of through the Western media which is portrayed of Africa, and they show Africa in a negative light, and people unfortunately believe that.
Yeah, I love your deep and extensive answer to that question. Thank you for adding that to it. Now, as a Pan-Africanist and a writer, I'd love to have your opinion on this. It is obvious that some African countries are lacking behind in terms of political stability and right government. As a writer who is passionate about the condition of the Black people in diaspora and all, what role do you think that writers have to play towards the unification of a country that is imminently tearing apart?
Okay, so I think that's quite a broad question. So I think that would depend on the country and what specifically is going on in the country. If I'm honest, before I could really say, because you would need to know more of what's actually happening on the ground before you could say maybe how authorship could influence a unification of a country. I think authorship, though, can certainly help in terms of educating people, but I don't necessarily know whether how that leads to unification, because it depends on what's going on in that country.
Okay, I'll take that from you. Thanks for that. Now, you also wrote about the iconic man, Marcus Garvey. Tell us about him and what impact do you think he has made in the Black community?
Well, Marcus Garvey, he had an organization called Universal, which still exists today, but it was more popular, around, say, like the 1920s, for example, and the early part of the 19th century. So the early part of the 20th century. Marcus Garvey's organization called Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, which was the biggest race-first organization. And, Marcus Garvey's motto was, "Up you mighty race, you can accomplish whatever you will." And Marcus Garvey's organization, they had the hotels, restaurants, businesses like steam laundry shops, newspapers. He had his own press printing company, the Negro World newspaper, which is a weekly publication. And he was an advocate that Black people, we need to, build a nation. Nation building was at the foundation of Marcus Garvey's teachings, and he was adamant that we needed to do that based on, the context of the time and the need for Black people to be self-sufficient and not to rely on, people of another race or ethnicity to govern our own destinies. He was saying that, we need to be the ones that are in control of our livelihood, in control of our businesses, in control of our politics, in control of our spirituality, in control of all aspects of our life. And Marcus Garvey was an advocate of repatriation. He had the Black Star Line with the intention to take Black people back to Africa. And that was what effectively they were planning towards. Now, things came in place and Garvey he was actually planning to go to Liberia. Things happened and the US government stopped that. And when he was in USCA, he got imported to Jamaica. But Marcus Garvey was born in St. Anne's in Jamaica. He's actually one of Jamaica's first national hero. But his impact is global, not just in Jamaica, but in the USA, in Africa, Malawi, where my dad is from. The flag of Malawi is in Marcus Garvey's colors. So the flag of Malawi was inspired by Garvey. A lot of the African leaders were inspired by Garvey. I've heard Robert Mugabe compliment Marcus Garvey. Yeah. Kwame Nkrumah, he said that of all the books he read, I think it was the Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, and Garvey's teachings that inspired him the most. Yeah. And the influence of Garvey extends to the diaspora, but also continent. Even though Garvey's main target audience was Black people in the diaspora, but the impact of Garvey also goes onto the continent. And Marcus Garvey was of the 20th century, he's probably the most eminent leader. He certainly had the book in the UNIA of all Black organizations. They had the biggest following. They had millions of people from, in Europe, in the Caribbean, in the Americas. That was a massive organization and a prime example of Black people doing for self. So the works of Marcus Garvey still lives on to this day, and the legacy is still inspiring people. And Marcus Garvey, a lot of movements such as the Rasta movement or even the Nation of Islam and other movements, that have been inspired by Garvey's teachings of Pan-Africanism, of unity, of self-reliance of the Black race and nation building. So that's just some information there about the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, because when I actually read about Marcus Garvey in the book, I think I've heard about him in time parts, but I don't really know much about him. So while I read about him in the Rise of Rastafari, I took my time again and make some sort of an extensive research on him. And it's also fun to your opinion of him from you. Now, there is a point that you made in your book, which I found very contemplative and debateful, which is a part in page 23 of the Rise of Rastafari, where you wrote that during slavery, the Black slaves became Christian because Christianity was imposed on them by their slave masters. You wrote of how the Blacks were made to submit to servitude by the influence of some biblical passages as seen in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44 to 46, and in Ephesians 6, verse 9, verse 5 rather, and in Timothy chapter 6, verse 1 and 2, etc. Tell us, are you trying to preach the notion that Christianity among the Black community today is a product of slavery?
The way we look at, in a sense, it is, in terms of the way Christianity came onto us in a lot of people. When I say us, not necessarily Africans on the continent, even though Christianity didn't come across, is not practiced the way it was centuries ago, and it came as the way it did through colonization and ministers going onto the continent. But I'm talking about there's a difference between that and how it came, to those in like the Caribbean and America, the descendants of enslaved Africans. But in terms of, it is in a sense because of how it was used, by white people, just like how they stripped Black people, off their languages. Like you say, in roots, it's called Kunta Kinte, and they named him Toby, and these kind of things, and the language, for example, and the culture, and the history, wrote them on the history and these kind of things. So Christianity was something that was used as a tool because it was the white masters, it was their religion, and they felt fit to put their own spirituality on the enslaved Africans, because the enslaved Africans weren't Christians. They were turned into Christians because they had no choice, many of them but to take on the religion of their master, and the Bible and that kind of thing was the only kind of things they had. And it was like pastors that would come and see slave masters, etc. And when you look at, that's why when you look at, say, even one of the kind of slavery films or whatever, where there's 12 years of slaves and all, and a lot of the films, I can't even name them all, but there's a lot of slavery films, you see a lot of Bible verses quoted in there, for example. So it's not something I'm just saying, I'm making up. So the Bible was used to keep slaves, the African people submissive, and there's quotes in the Bible that was used, such as Timothy 6:1, all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Timothy 6.2, those who have believing masters
should not show them
their worth. They should serve them, dear to them as fellow believers, and are devoted to the welfare of their slaves. Ephesians 6.5, slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. Exodus 21:20 to 21, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave, but if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be avenged, for the slave is his money. And lastly, Titus 2.9, slaves are to be submissive to their own masters in everything. They are to be well-pleasing, not argumentative. Now, these are some of the quotes that were, and these was used, and also the fact that it was used to justify slavery by people saying no. Outside of slavery, that's even in apartheid in South Africa, when the Dutch Reformed Church supported apartheid and said that, and used quotes in the Bible to justify it, and all of and other areas. But we're talking about transatlantic slavery now. But these are some these are quotes, and these are basically the reasons why why, for example, I say that the Bible was imposed on Africans, and to keep them submissive, to keep them from revolting and resisting against against oppressions. Because basically, if you look at quotes like these, then you're saying that, oh yeah, but there's a justified, or what, God would deal with it, or so it was to justify what the slave masters believed were Black people, African people's positions on earth. And that's why you don't have to agree with that fact, but that's how it was used at that period of time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I love that last sentence. You don't have to agree with it, but that was how it was used at that time to capture their heart. Well, thank you so much, Makonnen Sankofa, for talking about your book and about the transatlantic slave trade. It's a pleasure to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Makonnen Sankofa on racism. Makonnen Sankofa is the author of the best-selling book, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation, and also the author of the book, Life in Gambia, all of which I've left a link in the description part of this interview for viewers who would love to get a copy from Amazon. There is much to know about Makonnen Sankofa, ranging from him being a journalist to an entrepreneur, educator, public speaker, community activist, etc. But you'll get to know him better as we proceed in the interview. Welcome on the show, Makonnen.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's always nice to speak to you. It's a pleasure being on the show, and I look forward to sharing more information to your listeners.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. Makonnen, one of the key flags that you raised in your book, The Rise of Rastafari, is racism. And that was evidence where you wrote about the migration of the West Indians to England and how they were being maltreated, subjected to police brutality and public attack from racist groups such as the Teddy Boys and the National Front, NF. Could you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, so let's start with the mass migration now. After World War II happened, England was in a very bad state, and the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth, she invited people from the Caribbean to come to England to help rebuild up England following the destruction that was caused by the war. Yeah, so England needed to rebuild their labor force because a lot of people died in World War II. It was the most bloodiest war, that's most lives have been lost. So there was a shortage of the labor force in England. So the invitation was then sent by Queen Elizabeth to those in the Caribbean and other parts of the Commonwealth to come to England. Yeah, and those people answered the call. Those people in the Caribbean, many of them decided, for so-called what they thought was greener pastures, that they would, go to England. And the living conditions of a lot of people in the Caribbean was very difficult, and it was very hard, in a post really slavery period, in the colonial period, and people's lives were hard, and there wasn't a lot of opportunities and stuff, etc. So a lot of people thought, they go to England, and they had the propaganda, the illusion was that, the streets are paved with gold, and that, England, they went there with high aspirations of England. So between 1948, and there was a ship called the Empire Windrush. Now, that between 1948 to really about 1970, that the mass migration of people from the Caribbean is really known as the Windrush, that the Windrush generation were fallen into people that emigrated from the Caribbean islands during that period. Maybe not all of them traveled directly on that specific ship, the Windrush, but some of them traveled on other vessels, but they are known as the Windrush generation. Now, when these people from the Caribbean, they got to England, they realized the reality of England. They realized that the streets weren't paved with gold. The streets are paved a lot of times, but there's grey skies. They're used to the Caribbean where it's not sunny weather and everything. They're used to grey skies, these factory buildings and sometimes in houses that were built up better in the Caribbean, they saw inferior houses. Some of them in England, this dull, strange looking country, a hostile environment in terms of they weren't received well by the people. The white people in the society were very racist at the time and didn't accept the people from the Caribbean because they were racist, and they wanted to keep England white, and you had racist groups like the NF and the Teddy Boys. The NF stands for National Front, the Teddy Boys. They used to beat up black people in the streets for no reason other than them being black. They used to be signs on people's doors, and they didn't used to rent rooms, places to black people. There used to be no dogs, no blacks, no Irish, and it was a very, very hard time. It wasn't nothing like what they expected. All of their hope and aspirations, and they come to this country and they were treated so badly by the people in the country just because the color of their skin. And to a lot of people in the Caribbean at that time, for example, they didn't even know, they were just around black people. People didn't even understand, what racism was in that kind of sense. And then, until they come to England and see, like, what, someone doesn't like me because of the color of my skin. Like, what kind of craziness is that? And the society, so it was you had a lot of personal racism, but you also had a lot of institutional racism as well. Like, as I said, there was a lot of jobs, but black people were held back from getting, and it still happens to this day, certain positions, higher positions are, and institutional racism in terms of even the police brutality as well. So it was common, whether it wasn't, the races attacked by these groups like the NF and the Teddy Boys, then you had the police, that would, just see black people or black person and just, in the street, and just pick them up, put them into a police van, beat them up and take them to the station. Or, different laws things that they tried to put in place to do random stop and searches on black people and plant and basically put black people in prisons, particularly young black males. That was particularly black males, and especially young black males were often targeted by the police. And sometimes they were strung up on false charges and taken to prison. There's a you can Google it. There's some people called the Oval Four, and that was one of my brother's friend's dad was one of those people from the Oval Four. And basically he was in a place called the Oval, which is in London. They basically, the police framed them, put them to prison, beat them up, got them to make false confessions because they were beaten up, and they were sentenced to prison. And these are the kind of things that used to happen to black people on a regular basis in England in those kind of times. So it was very, very difficult to be a black person living in England in that kind of Windrush period.
Wow. Thank you very much for saying this, because when I actually read the book, I love your explanation of racism, and you're talking about the Teddy Boys and the National Front. It's quite intriguing to me. Now, you also talk about the effect of transatlantic slave trade in your book, Life in Gambia. And you wrote in page 22, and I quote, that the transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity that until this day has left a traumatic legacy on the descendants of those who were enslaved. I repeat myself again. The transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity that unto this day has left a traumatic legacy on the descendant of those who were enslaved. I love this quote, and I would love to have your more detailed opinion on it. How or in what way do you think that the transatlantic slave trade influenced racism?
Because the mentality of racism stayed in the minds of the people. So even though the chains were taken off, the descendants of the enslaved Africans, and for those of us who are descendants of enslaved Africans, of our ancestors, the slavery on the plantation, that kind of thing. But the way that generally the white society at the time looked at black people was still in inferiority, and promoting white supremacy. And there was laws and several things that put in place. So like in the Caribbean, I could even use, even in sport, the captain of the West Indies cricket team had to be a white man, I think up until like the 60s. And the 60s is not a really long time ago, considering. So, and this is after slavery. I'm saying this is going into colonial years now. So, these things, some of these, the reminiscence of it is still existing today. And if you look at in America, for example, laws were put in place after the emancipation, where different laws were put in place to hold back black people from getting the same privileges and the same rights.
Right.
And you know what, you had the Jim Crow laws in the United States, and segregation, which segregated white and black people from going to schools, from socializing together, from mixing, going to the same hospitals, from different parts of the restaurants. Black people had to be in the back of the bus, white people at the front. From all restaurants, dedicate different parts, different toilets, different water fountains, all kind of aspects of the society. And because they were still with that kind of mentality, you know, that black people are slaves, and less, and you know, not a full human being. I think in you know, in United States law, in the Constitution, it was like 3/5 of a human being are black people. And you know, in transatlantic slave trade, the reason why a lot of the, you know, the slave masters and the cruelty was done, because a lot of people had to like convince themselves, the white slave masters, that, you know, black people were subhuman in that things, to kind of justify these kind of vicious acts that they did. And then after slavery ended, some of the things that were put in place to kind of, you know, to get people, to get black people in a similar situation was laws that were put in place where black people basically were put in prison and then forced to work in labor, you know, on prison in similar kind of environments that were like slavery, for example. A black person couldn't talk, you know, couldn't shout or raise his voice at a white woman. Yeah. And, you know, there's several instances where, you know, where black black men who, you know, who, for example, looked at a white woman, for example, could be lynched, or and these kind of things could happen. You had a black man who just whistled at a white woman, and then, you know, he was killed by a mob of white people. Yeah, and I mentioned that because it's a very big popular case. But, you know, things like lynchings that happened, you know, to black people, and this is all kind of stems, you know, from the ill treatment from going from slavery, which set up a lot of the framework from racism in how the minds of, you know, what the oppressive white people think about black people.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, I was also going to ask you, as someone who has lived in the UK, what was the most thing you hated about the degradation of the blacks by the white? And how would you address the ill perception of superior and inferiority based on skin color?
I think now, we're talking about nowadays in this state of age, I think it's the fact of, whereas in my parents' generation or grandparents' generation, it would have been, you know, like literally physical race. It could have been physical, you know, racism, like as in white people or police attacking you in the street and putting you, or police officers putting you in prison and that kind of stuff, and not being able to like rent certain accommodations and that kind of things. Where I think racism now is more subtle, but I would say in terms of black people are still treated, and we've always been treated in the UK since arriving here, as who you are, what you do, for example. You could be the best in your profession. Like I've been the best in my profession in terms of best salesman in the country. You can be, you know, a top footballer earning X amount of money. You could be a top lawyer, top barrister. No matter whatever you do, you're always treated by the environment, you know, as a second-class citizen. And so, and the bar is always set for. I think a lot of, you know, the institutional society, the white society, they're happy to see nowadays, you know, they would be content with seeing a black person in an organization who's at a low level of organization. They were happy to see a black person be a cleaner, a security guard. They're happy to see a black person in a low position. But when you try to rise above it and you become, you know, more into like managerial positions or telling, you know, effectively your white counterparts what to do, that becomes a problem. And it stopped a lot of people, for example, that, you know, made from having, you know, successful professional careers, and, you know, and certain businesses as well. So I think it's the fact that racism today can hold down your prospects of, you know, what of your bar of what you can achieve. Some people say, you know what, as black people, we have to work twice as hard and free. To me, that's true, but to me, that's nonsense. We can't be in a mentality where, you know, we have to work 2-3 times as hard as someone else just because of skin color. Why should we have to work 3-4 times hard? So I really don't like that concept of, you know what, I should have to work 3-4 times as hard as someone else because of my skin color is this color. So yeah, I think I've just answered the question.
Wow, that's quite, you know, it's quite deep. It's quite pretty much deep. Now, I also realized that your actual birth name is Matthew Babek. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And could you tell us about the making of your, maybe I will say, new name, Makonnen Sankofa? How does this name come about?
So my birth name was Matthew Babek, and
Okay.
I changed my name to Makonnen Sankofa when I was 23. Yeah, I'm 31 now. I was 23 or 22 when I changed my name.
Wow.
So early 20s. The reason why I changed my name, I felt I needed a name that's become more African conscious. Myself, I'm a Rastafarian. I needed a name that could reflect my identity. I think, Matthew is a Bible, is a Christian name.
Yeah.
I'm not a Christian. Burbeck is, a family name. I don't think it reflects my identity. So I changed my name to Makonnen. Now Makonnen is a name that was Haile Selassie, and Haile Selassie's father had family name before he was known as Haile Selassie. Before he was called Haile Selassie, he was known as Rastafari Makonnen, yeah, and his father is Ras Makonnen. Now, Haile Selassie, when he was the regent and etc., he was known as that name, Rastafari Makonnen, before he became the emperor of Ethiopia. When he became the emperor, he took on his baptismal name, his birth name of Emperor Haile Selassie. So, as my admiration for Haile Selassie and me being a Rastafari, I decided to then adopt the name Makonnen. Now, Sankofa, that is a Ghanaian name, and from the Akan people of Ghana, and it means the symbol of the bird, and the saying is to go back and fetch. Yeah, and you see a picture of a bird looking backwards. And to elaborate on that, it means to go back and know your roots, to go back to study, find the roots, so you can use what you know from the past and learn from the past to move forward in the future. And I think that kind of philosophy embodies me as a person in terms of Sankofa. I'm very conscious one, and I'm very much one seeking and learning from history and etc. And I think history is such an important thing. I mean, if you don't know what happened yesterday, like even today is based off a lot of times things that happened yesterday. Yeah, and that could be yesterday, whether it's literally yesterday, or yesterday, whether it's 110 years ago, whatever. History is so important, and sometimes the problem we have as a people is because we just, we're told to forget about everything. It happened in the past, whatever it is, or history is not important. No other race of people think like this. For example, I remember a white person, a teacher, that lecturer that I had in university, and something that stood up to me was like, yeah, I might not have been around, this time or whatever, but I know everything. I know what was going on at that time, and he was always telling me the value of history, for example. And this is something, again, another internalization I think a lot of our people have from slavery. And our parents try to say, oh, you know what, if you need to forget about history or whatever. And again, and through colonization, but you know what, white people they know about the history and they hold on to their history. And Asian people, they do the same thing. For example, history is very, very important to them. But it's we as Black people, we're the ones that are always told, that our history is irrelevant, and to forget about things that have happened in the past.
Wow, I love your answer to that, and this one will make me to move into another sort of question. You said you were around 22 or 23 while you changed your name from Babek to Makonnen Sankofa, and I was curious to ask you, during that time that you were changing your name, what was the opinion of your parent then? Did you receive any sort of reputation or something like they criticizing you of wanting to change their family name to your own newly name made based on history and what you've read to Makonnen Sankofa?
Well, there wasn't any ill feelings. I was raised in my mom's family, not my father. My mom's family are my mom, her parents are from the Caribbean, from Jamaica. My dad is from Malawi, Southeast Africa.
Okay.
So I most of my childhood, I was raised in a single parent household. I only really came in much contact with my father. When I was little, like a 1-2-year-old, I might have seen him, but I don't really know what was going on there. But generally, until like my teens, about 14, 15, he was out of, our lives. So when my mum found about it, I mean, I think she would obviously, I think any parent preferred if I kept my name, that name, but she wasn't like angry or anything like that. But my dad, I think when he came to find out about it, and he didn't really even say anything. It was just like kind of, he just took it is what it is. So I didn't really have any of my parents that were really mad or anything. I think my mum maybe would preferred if I kept my name the same, but it wasn't like, she was angry with me. But at that time I was, I was living on my own. I've been very independent since I've been 19. I've pretty much always lived on my own since I left to go to university and have my own place, my apartment, and where I was at my stage of life and whatever. I was like, I want to do this regardless of, whatever people think, because this is me, this is my identity, and this is, I think, a name that I think reflects my identity.
Wow, well, that's quite deep, and I think I would say it's a strong decision to make. Okay, now Makonnen, could you tell us about your personal experience with racial discrimination in England?
Yeah, I've had racial discrimination in terms of whether it's in jobs, in work, in terms of employment, when I've gone, to go for certain promotion, or when I've gone for applying in certain positions that I know that I've not got because I'm black. And it's subtle in England, for example. So someone's not going to come up and blatantly say, "Oh, I'm not giving you this job because you're black." Yeah, but it's subtle. So just because someone doesn't directly say that to your face does not mean that's not racism. Yeah, and this is the reason why. And this is the reason why a lot of people a lot of white people will use that to say to you, "Well, how do you know that's racism?" Because I didn't say, I did it because your skin color, to kind of basically sidestep the fact that it is racism. So you don't have to say to someone's face, that you're racist, or you don't like that person's black. Yeah, but you can do that you can stop people from getting in certain positions or certain things. Yeah, and I know, for example, in certain jobs that I've done, where I will know that, if I was as good as what I did, that my white counterparts would have certainly got a lot further in terms of promotional positions. So it has like held me back from, in terms of, well, I'm not saying held me back, it stopped me from progressing in certain areas, but I've always been successful in jobs and works that I do. So when I say hold me back, I mean I've always been able to be good, and in the places that I worked or whatever, when I've left, they always wanted me to stay or come back. So but in terms of work environments, I would say that I know a specific example was when I was working at a company, and I decided to, I was going for a managerial position. I decided to not pursue it in the end, but the amount of, I knew that if I been white and based on my level of expertise and how good I was at doing my job, that I would have been pushed forward into into that kind of role a lot more simpler. The person I employed to do that role, was a white lady that came in with little or no background in who didn't know the knowledge, and then came asking me for advice on how to do certain things. Yeah. Wow. So I know if I was a black person or a black woman, or even a black man or woman, you would not have got that position at that company if you was a black person and not a white lady with no experience. So these are some an example. I mean, in terms of renting, I've had accommodation. Even though I've offered some, in one case, I remember I offered to pay 6 months rent up front, and it was just like, it was very dismissive straight away when the person wanted to rent to me, and it was always like one hurdle over the other. Then it was like an extra fee, this and that was coming, and yeah, I just got the impression that he just didn't want to rent. The person acting, the estate agent person that I was in contact with, he didn't want to rent to me. I've had examples like, even when I was coming back from Gambia to England in 2019. Now this is the fourth time I've been to the Gambia, but the third time when I was living in Gambia for 6 months, hence the book Life in Gambia, the Smiling Coast of Africa. And I was stopped at the airport, by the immigration officers, and I mentioned this in the book. I was stopped at the airport by the immigration officers, stroke police people, that the police, immigration police, when you're coming back in, and they stopped me and searched me for drugs. I was the only black person walking past that, part of the airport, and I just happened to be, and you get me, and they would just say, oh, it's a coincidence. They just happened to stop the only black person that's walking back there and search my briefcase for drugs. And it's the way they treated me. I was almost like treated like I was a criminal, like,
Wow.
and this was to show me the fact is that I went from the Gambia to meeting, ministers and people that are, high up there and footballers and head of this and head of these organizations and companies, and being treated and being like at the top end of the society, being treated almost like royalty in a way. And then they go back to England and they're treated like second-class citizens. They're treated like, you're scum. They're treated like you're worthless. So that's the kind of examples. I've had other examples in my experience that I remember that when I was at university days. I mean, and I've been called, before I go into university days, I mean, I've been called a black bastard before. I've seen cars going past and called me, a black cunt, and being with friends of mine and black and had names called out. I remember a time when I was at university and me and a friend was at this a venue that was going to, and they didn't want to let him in the venue. I knew it was because he was black. They didn't want to let him in the venue. I came then, and the security guard was saying, oh, he's being aggressive, this, that, and the other. And he's a little guy about my half. I said, he was a small guy, and he's like, and I knew what was going on. They didn't want to let him in because he was black. Now, we'd been into the venue. There's a VIP section and there's a normal section of the venue. We'd been into the regular area of the venue, but you have to go out around the corner to go to the VIP. And when you go into the normal part of the section, you have to show them your identification to get in. So I left the normal part of the section to go to the VIP where I thought my friend was going to be, and he was denied entry of getting in there. They didn't want us to get in there, so I said, "Come, let's go." So we go back into the normal part of there. We've already showed the doorman and the ID, etc. He's asked us again to present the ID. Yeah, wow. When he's seen us clearly, a white person's walking in, no ask for ID, whatever they. People for ID. Do you understand? These are the kind of things. I remember another time I went to a venue. It was me and my friend, and it was with two friends, two women. These were two white women, and it's like they kind of broke us up from them, and they let the two women go in, two white women, and then it was us. They basically separated out, and then even one of the security guards was being too quite aggressive to one of my friends. So these are just some examples, but there's more, man. Living in England is a constant thing. And I just want to add another example, by the way, is that I remember one time also getting on a coach, and you have to buy a ticket. You buy a ticket to get on the coach, and I was going to work, and the website was down, and I couldn't buy a ticket, and then the person driving the vehicle they're meant to be able to sell you a ticket, but he was like, the machine's down, and he couldn't sell me a ticket, the coach driver. So he sent me to this place down the road. The system was down, so I then got on the coach. I was like, well, I can't, the website is not working online. You don't have your system's not working. The system down the road isn't working. You've got to let me on there because it's not my fault. Your systems are not working. So I got on the coach, and then he stopped the coach, and he says that, if you don't get off or whatever, I'm going to call the police. He called the police and said that they would arrest me and this, that, and the other. And I knew those kind of situations. What happened in those situations there? A policeman will get on the will get in the coach, will arrest you, and the coach driver will say, there's that bad person there. He hasn't bought a ticket and he's got on the coach. And then the police will arrest you, and then they will look for you to do something, that provokes that kind of action for them to give you a proper reason to arrest you.
Wow, that's quite an experience. Now, your answer to that question would want me to move into a more similar question. I'd love to ask you, why do you think people are racist, or why do people feel racist towards certain people, color, tribe, or ethnics? What are the factors, in your opinion, that you think promote racism in an environment?
I think there's various different things. There's different levels. There's different kinds of racism. You have personal racism and you have institutional racism. So someone might just be personally racist because they don't like the skin color of people when you look or whatever. But then institutional racism is which stops you from, getting into certain positions, like I mentioned, like job or certain, positions of power, etc. So there's many different reasons, depending on example. I mean, some of it could be, I think for some people, times it could be greed, it could be power, it could be jealousy. These are some of the reasons. But I think we're talking about, and let's call it what it is, that generally a lot of racism is thrown up against us as Black people of African heritage. And what we're talking about a lot, is racism. So because I don't know, anywhere where, Black people have gone and have imposed, people of African heritage have gone and conquered people's land and then imposed apartheid and laws in place, that stops the native people from having the same rights as the people that have moved to that country. I don't know anywhere where Black people have enslaved people. I don't know anywhere where in Africa where people of other races come and Black people are so hostile to people of other races. So I think that I don't think it's when we say we. I think it's a thing. I think other races, particularly white people, who've done it the most, but also other races of people have an issue with black people, and I think this is what it is. And I don't know why. You'd have to ask those people why they hate us so much. But when I see, for example, when I look at the neutrality, and I don't want to say this goes beyond just white people, but I'm going to say this now because this is what a lot of what we've been talking about. A lot of the racism that has been done on Black people has been done predominantly by to the levels that it's been done on has been done the worst by white people. Yeah, and I'm not saying not every single white person, because it's good and bad.
I understand. Sure.
Yeah, but I'm talking about but I'm not going to say not all every time I speak, but when I'm talking about racism, for example, this is what I've said to you. And it's not just slavery, because this is something that people often try to use to kind of trip up Black people and say that, oh, you lot are just talking about slavery, that's in the past, but forget over it. A lot of what I mentioned, for example, is racism that's still going on to this day. Yeah, in terms of the way that Black people are treated. So we're not talking about just something that happened 400 or 500 years ago, because if slavery happened, and after slavery, Black people were treated normally and equal, whatever, we would look at slavery and be like, it was horrific that happened, but that was something that happened in that generation, that past. But the fact is, these kind of racism has continued on ever since then. It has continued on, like I mentioned, in Jim Crow law, has continued on in the way that Black people were treated in this country, from when they went from the migration of the Windrush, like my grandparents, until this day. This continued on in the minds of Africa and the continent, and why Africa is in the way it is today, and the colonization. So what I'm saying is, when you have people that for no reason, look at the incident that happened in Buffalo, and the white supremacists that all of a sudden that went into the school and started randomly killing. I think it was a supermarket, wasn't it? And he started randomly killing Black people in the supermarket. And the incidents years ago in Carolina, where you had another white person that went into a church and just started randomly killing Black people. Despite everything that has been done to Black people, you never see Black people. You never see Black people all of a sudden went into a supermarket and decided that he's just going to kill some random people because they're white. But so what I'm trying to say is that white people have got a problem with Black people, and they've got a racist, and they need to basically. So I can't answer why there's so much wickedness within it and so much hatred. Just because, how can you hate someone, look at someone just because of the color of their skin, and want to do bad things to someone just because of someone has a different skin color from you? And now going beyond just white people, but you also have say other races of people, Asian people. I know people that have married Asian people, that have had relationships with Asian people, Black, and they've been the Asian person has disowned that Asian person because they've got a Black partner. And these are the things, for example, Chinese. I know people that have been in relationship with, well, not Asian, I mean more like Indian now, or Pakistani. But when you have you have then Chinese people as well. But even how the Chinese look at African people, it's in an inferior way. And I don't know what it is, but it's like we as Black people, we are not the ones that are going out there in the world and doing all these things. I think racism has been done by all groups of people. Arabic people, you have the Arabic slave trade, and the way Arabic people treat Africans, by Asian people, by white people. But it's been done the worst by white people against black people in general. But I think I don't get it. It's crazy, and I think there's something that's just built in white people where they just have this barbaric nature. But you know, they do bad things to each other as well. So we can't just say it's always just on you know, on black people. It's just, you know, because I've even witnessed it myself. Other white people have treated and talked to white people like this, and I've been like, it's horrible. So it's But I think I think I've pretty much covered what you.
Yeah, I love your answer to that. And in my own opinion, I would also love to add this to my own side, because I know that, not like you said, not all white have been racist towards the black. And again, I'd also love to say that most black hate themselves. Like, we've seen opinion, we've seen cases. And let me just say that it has to do with the matter of the human heart, like the human conscience, the human psychology, the human mind, your level of education, your level of exposure. Because we've had most instances and most cases whereby the black even kill themselves. It happens very well here in Nigeria. Recently, we have group of people, some people calling themselves Islamic people, killing a particular young lady just for blasphemy of the Prophet Muhammad. And recently, not far from my state here, a particular church was attacked by some unknown gunmen, and they just went there and killed the worshippers without having anything, without any cause of, probably they've committed an offense or a crime. They just walk in there and kill people like that. So I think, you know, such kind of people, the sort of art that they have towards killing another person is a sort of art, an hatred art, jealousy in the mind. And, you know, all this kind of issue affected the human psyche is a sort of thing that I would love to say that makes most people to be racist. And you can also see it manifesting itself from the white to the black, and from the black to the black, or the white to the white, etc. I just have to say that it depends on the matter and the conscience and state of the person's heart.
Well, I think I just want to come back now and say that, you know, a lot of like what you mentioned, for example, that I think, again, you know, that's talking more religious in terms of that, you know, why that particular incident happened. And in general, unfortunately, religion has that's been taken into another conversation now. But you know what, religion and, you know, and has, whether, you know, Christianity or Islam, but it has bad things have been done and people have been killed in the name of religion. So I think that's taking it onto that's a kind of a different kind of area or example, but a different motivation than just necessarily just the racism, because then people just doing it because of, you know, not necessarily I'm doing it because I'm racist, but I'm just doing it because you know, I'm in this religion, I believe this is part of my religion, or because of, you know, but then still those kind of reasons could be power, greed, or whatever. But a lot of it will be like, oh, because of, you know, because of my faith and you're not in my faith or whatever. Not that it's justifiable, but I think that, you know what, wherever you look at the world, for example, wherever European, wherever white people have gone, there's been a problem and they've caused destruction. Like whether it is in Australia and the Aborigine people and what they've done to the Aborigine people, not just with African people, black people, because we've not just got this beyond the bottom of black people, but look at Asia, the colonization of, you know, Asia. Look at, you know, what China, the colonization, you know, of China and Japan. So yes, you have Africa, like the continent that's been colonized, and places like South Africa where apartheid was imposed. When you come, you know, to their supposedly country, even though it's not their country, Britain, the way that you're treated, America, you know. So I think anywhere white people have gone around the world, they have caused, you know what, they have racially oppressed people. And again, not every single white people, but I'm saying a high proportion of those.
Oh. Thank you so much, Makonnen Sankofa, for talking about racism and for shedding more light on your book, The Rise of Rastafari and Life in Gambia. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
You're welcome. Makonnen Sankofa on Africa's colonization. Makonnen Sankofa is the author of the best-selling book, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation, and he's also the author of the book, Life in Gambia, all of which I've left a link in the description part of this interview for viewers who would love to get a copy directly from Amazon. There is much to know about Makonnen Sankofa from him, ranging from being a journalist to an entrepreneur to an educator, public speaker, community activist, etc. But you get to know him better as we proceed in the interview. Welcome on the show, Makonnen.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to, talking to you more on the show.
It's a pleasure to have you. Makonnen, colonization has been viewed as one of the major moves towards the falling down of most African nations today. Or let me say that a lot of people have different opinions about colonization in Africa, while majority term it as a selfish act by the colonial masters are taking advantage of most of African nation resources, etc. Other people are of the opinion that it has some advantage that it offers Africans till today. Let's hear from you. What impact do you think colonization has made in the African society today?
Well, regarding the impact of colonization, it has changed the structure of Africa in terms of, governance and how the countries in Africa are governed. So, historically, countries in Africa have been ruled by, kings, emperors, chiefs, and elders.
Yeah.
Whereas now you see, a model, a European system of governments that has come across into the various different countries of Africa. So I think that's one of the main areas is the system of governance, which is modeled over, a European-centric system, and a system that works for Europe doesn't necessarily reflect a system that's going to work for, African countries.
Yeah.
And the fact that we're talking about African countries as well as an example, because before colonialism, there was no such thing as this country and that country, and there was no borders in sense of Africa, for example. Africa, I'm not going to say Africa was on one whole and it was was all singing and dancing and singing kumbaya and all of that. There's always been infighting and tribal wars and stuff like that, for example. But Africa as a whole didn't have borders, and there was movement between one country to the other country, and a lot of the turmoil that is in Africa today still stems from the reminiscence of colonization, and what people may say is a lot of things like the lack of advancement is as a result of colonization, because effectively that we're still in Africa is still in a neo-colonial state. You're talking about 30, 40 years ago, the struggle for independence 50 years ago was still going on, and that's not a long time in the long state in the long run of things. And we're seeing the resources of Africa that are still being exploited to this day, whether it's stuff like cobalt in the Congo, whether it's the gold, whether it's crude oil, whether it is, Africa has got so much natural resources, but it's not working for the benefit of the people on the continent. Yeah, it's working for the benefit of people, in Europe, in other places, and abroad. And some of the turmoil that you see in parts of Africa, such as the Congo or Belgium, and these are still rooted in the colonization or the invasion of the African countries. And when you talk about the francophone countries, which I think there's about 14 francophone countries in Africa, like you have Senegal, Burkina Faso, Togo, Guinea-Bissau, and other francophone countries as well, like Ivory Coast and others. Yeah, but the colonial debt, so to speak, as in they were colonized by France. When France left those countries, they said that they're gonna, unless they're paid in compensation for the quote unquote building for infrastructure and certain things, that they left the buildings, that they're gonna basically destroy the infrastructure and the buildings in those countries. And as a compromise, the African countries, they're paying back, money every single year. I think the France Central Bank collects around 500 billion each year from, African countries as a result of colonial debt. And there was one particular president that tried to refuse doing that. And, the French, they completely destroyed that, broke down that country. And to set that as an example for people that, other African countries, African leaders that are not going to follow that as an example. And when you have had other leaders that basically have said that, this is wrong, this colonial debt. What do you mean? They colonize us and we're paying them back money, for example. But you've seen that what's happened then is, the assassination of these leaders. Yeah. So these is again some of the destabilization because of colonialism. You have the World Bank and the IMF that send money for like loan and aid, and that comes with stipulations. That Africa has to do this and Africa has to do that, which are basically rules of governing the country from the outside, because it's like, oh, you not only get the money, but if you do this, if you abide by our rules, and those kind of stipulations that come with are not necessarily in the best interest. You have the high interest loans that are done, so high loans which keep Africa more and more in debt, and loans that are not going to get paid back within a certain time, and then you have people defaults on these loans. So the colonization has influenced Africa in many ways in terms of, spirituality. Even you could say Africa now, a lot of the countries are heavily Christianized and is Islamic. That's not to say Christianity and Islam didn't exist in Africa prior, certainly European colonization. However, how those, particularly Christianity, how it is practiced today, is because of a result of the colonization of how Christianity, the way it was presented, brought back into Africa by the Europeans, and the Europeanized version of Christianity that we see. For example, like the white image of Christ is one example. You can go to churches in Nigeria where you are. I've been in churches in Gambia where you have all black people there, but you see a white image of Jesus Christ as a savior in an all black country, in a country where people, these are kind of things that subliminally that colonialism has done. You can say even Arabic, let's not say Christianity, but even before the European colonization, but the Arabic invasion of Africa, and how Arabized. I'm in the Gambia now, and when you see people that have left the African names and people with Islamic names, basically, and the Arabic influence on countries, which is more like in line, with following, Arabic traditions and customs and culture, and that often points to the denigration of, African spirituality or African history, African culture. I mean, these are some of, just some of the ways that colonialism and also, the Arabic invasion has, affected Africa as a continent.
Wow, that's great. I love your sort of educative response to this. It's pretty much enlightening. Now, I'd also love to have your take on this, since we are talking about Africa's colonization. How did the social structure of African society change during the colonial era? Also, how much of these changes can directly be attributable to colonialism itself?
Well, one of the main changes that I mentioned in the previous question was, I told you, was the system of governance.
Yeah.
And that can wholly be attributed to, the colonialism. There's no ifs or buts or maybes about that, because as I said before, the African countries were not governed like the way they were governed now before, colonialism. Yeah, with the Berlin Conference, when all these countries were divided and turned into orders, and then you had the countries which were controlled by European nations such as France, England, Belgium, Germany, and different European countries, and their system of governance, even though that they left, they still left their system of governance that they used through colonialism in place. So it's not gone back to what was the system of governance before colonialism. That is still being maintained, and these countries are generally the countries that colonized them are the countries that they are in close allegiance with. Yeah, so the countries colonized by the French, their allegiance to the France, and they're colonized by the English, they've got their allegiances with the English. And then the language that we speak as well in societal structure, the language spoken on the continent, there is, some own African languages, but generally, for example, like you see, Francophone countries, speak French, still speak French as well as a main language. English countries that were colonized still speak English, as a main language. Portuguese countries like Mozambique speak Portuguese, So how the language that we use in a lot of the African countries That just shows, for example, the impact of colonialism. And even, say, for example, you could say even before colonialism and Arabic invasion, which I mentioned a bit previously before, even like, say, in, say, Swahili and Wolof, some of the words in those in that language is influenced by say Arabic. So these are some of the ways where the society has changed through colonialism, and also a little bit I've mentioned from the Arabic invasion of Africa as well.
Wow, I love your answer to that question. Now I want to ask you sort of a similar question. Why do you think, or why has much of post-colonial Africa suffered a series of recurrent political, economic, and social catastrophe since 1980? Are all of those problems and failures, in fact, linked or connected to colonization?
I think they are linked to colonization. Yeah. How Africa is in the position it is in today. Yeah, and when I say this as well, for example, because Africa is a continent, not a country. Because sometimes when we think of Africa, we think about it as a country. Africa is a continent, and you know what? Africa is still beautiful and it's still lovely. Yeah, but I'm saying to you why it's been held back in certain ways, and why there is certain issues and problems. There's issues and problems everywhere, but we're talking about Africa here. And what you have is that in the independence struggles in, like, say, the 60s and 70s, etc., to get independence, a lot of the leaders that were, we'll say, progressive and real staunch activists in terms of our people being free from colonial rule, not just like legally, but also in terms of social structures, in terms of our minds, and really trying to get rid of all the vestiges of colonialism, like Tora Sankara, who's really a hero of mine, for example. A lot of them were assassinated. So you have the Sankaras, the Nkrumahs, the Lumumbas, all assassinated. So when you have African leaders that have tried to rise up and to empower and embetter Africa as a continent, and for Africa to get Africa to be free as it should be, not just legally, in terms of constitution, that kind of stuff, but when they've tried to put economic clout, like Gaddafi, who wanted one currency for the whole of Africa, for example, he was killed. Robert Mugabe, when he wanted to take the land, when he took the land back from the white people who originally stole the land off the native Zimbabwean people, and the way that he was attacked by the Western media, who had nothing but good things to say about him before he took the land, and then when he took the land, all of a sudden he became was like the Black Hitler and this and that. He was knighted by the Queen of England before that, and nothing but good things were said about him. But as soon as he took the land back, as soon as ZANU-PF and the people of Zimbabwe took the land back, he was criticized, and then, for example, eventually that led to the downfall of Mugabe, and the downfall really of the Zimbabwean economy. But whenever you have strong leaders in Africa that try to do good things, Idi Amin, look what he did. He recognized the Asians in Uganda were taking too much control and too much power, so he kicked the Asians out of Uganda. And again, how the Western media portrayed him to be. So any leaders that are not working in the interests of white supremacy, of the powers that be in Europe, in America, for example, they are then under an extreme amount of pressure. And often, they're killed or assassinated, and sometimes they're set up by their own people, like in the case of Patrice Lumumba. And this is the problem. And then people look at it and say, well, why can't Africa do this? Why can't Africa do that? Because when you have a strong leaders that try to rise up to empower the continent, this is the kind of result that what happens. They're killed or often assassinated.
Wow, that's quite amazing to know. I so much love to applaud you for that. Now, I want to ask you sort of question. Why do you think the European first take an interest in the African continent? I know that this might have, if you ask someone this question, they might have a lot of opinions and ideas of their reason why they think European folks take an interest in African. Why do they not go to Asia? I know probably some places were also being colonized by the European, but I want to ask you specifically, why do you think the European folks take an interest in the African continent?
Country that's rich in resources more than anywhere else on this planet. Everything you need is, in terms of resources is in Africa. There's, the crude oil, the material, the cobalt for the phone, the gold, gas, coal, iron, tin, unlimited resources. You're talking about Africa, a place, so everything, is in terms of resources is in Africa, and that's exactly why they went there to basically exploit these resources, which they're still doing to today, because a lot of the things that we use, like I said, like the mobile phones that we use, the cobalt that comes from that we use in the mobile phone comes from the Congo, and a lot of the resources that we use, like oil and etc., that are taken with the cocoa, for the cocoa beans in places like Ghana and other parts of Africa. A lot of the things are exported from Africa. So they went there and they realized that Europe doesn't have the resources. There are parts of the world that have resources, but they're not as rich and as abundant as in Africa. So I think that is very much the reason why they went there. They saw the resources and they saw there was fertile land and for example as well, ideal for farming, because some people that settled there, like in South Africa, etc. They went there and they farmed on the land and etc. But they saw that also the climate. Why would you want to be in Europe when you've got beautiful sun and beaches? So it's also looking at those parts of Africa as well. But I mean the prime reason is what the resources, because even the way that Africa was colonized in a lot of places, like say here in the Gambia, how the British have colonized the Gambia. They've colonized it. But the way that it was done is like, the routes of exportation is basically set among the river of Gambia. So for them to get the resources or to get whatever exporting out of the country, and whether it's like transport, like trailing or transportation like by a boat or onto like the coast or whatever, but a lot of things are also set in terms of the infrastructure of how they can get things, whether it's like Gambia through on the river of Gambia, where they didn't develop and build up the whole country, but they just developed that certain area where they can get resources exploited easily they're taken out of the country. So in answer to your question, it's definitely the resources which have been the main reason, which is why they invaded here and stayed here during the colonial years.
Well, I love your answer to that. And I want to actually ask you for the last question on this part of the interview. I know we've actually talked about this in our previous conversation. I want to ask you, what impact has colonization and slavery have to do with the invention of religion in Africa?
How we see religion, how we do it as today, particularly with if you're looking at Christianity, for example. So first of all, there's colonialism and slavery. We'll look at them in two different perspectives. But let's say colonialism on the continent, the way that African spirituality before, you had Christianity, you had more African spirituality practices along the continent. So that's been replaced with Christianity, and very much a Europeanized concept of Christianity that was being passed on by missionaries and colonizers that went to Africa. So if you look at, say, the Congo, and King Leopold, who's a Belgian people, they massacred, I think it was like 11 million people, millions of people in the Congo. Not a lot of people know about this, but King Leopold, the atrocities that were done in the Congo and African people by the Belgians, and they forced, the people there into labor, and then if they couldn't meet their quota, they would actually cut their hands off of the men, and they would keep the woman, as prisoners, unless the man would bring back unless the man met their quota, and all kinds of atrocities were done. But they sent in Christian ministries to basically subdue the people before they carried out their actions in the Congo. And you look at, say, in South Africa with apartheid and the Dutch Reformed Church that supported slavery, and the Christianity being really looked at and used as a way to justify slavery, because it wasn't like the justification of Christianity in apartheid, not just by the Dutch Reformed Church, but by even people outside of that in South Africa, part of the the apartheid, part of that were pro-apartheid. And in terms of colonialism, the image of, we mentioned this before, of obviously a white Christ, in terms of what that does to the psyche of Black people, in terms of, you have countries which are predominantly Black, and then to be worshipping someone that doesn't look like you, and someone who's actually people that are actually oppressing you, and then you're worshipping that person, that does serious damage to the psyche of our people. And it says, if you're then going to worship someone that doesn't look like you, what does that say about your self-esteem, how you look at yourself as a people? And what does that say about the person you worship? Because you must say that all those people or the other color must be godly then, because if your image of God is of a white man or of something, another ethnicity, but I'm using white man because of talking about Christianity in the image of white Christ, then that leads them to have lack of racial self-esteem, to think that if God is white, for example, that means white people must be godly and superior. That kind of subliminal message comes in, and people on the continent, a lot of Africans, for example, they can't see any concept of God as Black or anything like that. They this Eurocentric white image of a Christ. So to go to parts of Africa and places and see a white image of Christ, for example, where there's hardly, like, white people make up probably less than 1% of a population. That's a remnants of manifestation of colonialism and neocolonialism. So that would, I would say, in terms of how the effect of religion on linking with colonization, and still exists in some elements today. In slavery, during slavery, the way that Christianity was brought to the descendants of enslaved Africans, when the descendants of slave Africans, when it was brought to the enslaved Africans, not descendants of slave Africans, the way that Christianity was brought to enslaved Africans, now on the continent, Christianity did, rudiments of Christianity existed prior to slavery. Christianity didn't necessarily just form as slavery as it came about. However, most Africans on the continent, certainly West Africa, that were captured, were not practicing Christianity until slavery. And the way that it'd been put upon them, in terms of like the white Christ, in terms of they wasn't told take parts of the Bible like Ethiopia, there's African places that are biblical in there. It wasn't told that they was used to really, like, quotes in the Bible to keep them the slaves submissives and not want to really like rebel, and to kind of justify the reason and to say these are the descendants of Ham, and it says that or Canaan, they should be cursed and these kind of things. So it was really used to justify and to keep the Africans submissive.
Oh, thank you so much for talking about Africa's colonization and also shedding more light on the Rise of Rastafari and Life in Gambia. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Makonnen Sankofa on Life in Gambia. Makonnen Sankofa is the author of the best-selling book, The Rise of Rastafari, Resistance, Redemption, and Repatriation, and is also the author of Life in Gambia, all of which I've left a link in the description part of this interview for viewers who would love to get a copy from Amazon. There is much to know about Makonnen Sankofa, ranging from being a journalist to an entrepreneur, an educator, public speaker, community activist, etc. But you'll get to know him better as we proceed in the interview. Welcome on the show, Makonnen.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to the show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you again. You know, Makonnen, without giving too much information away, could you tell us about the making of your book, Life in Gambia, the Smiling Coast of Africa?
Yeah, so Life in Gambia, the Smiling Coast of Africa was a book that I read, and it was published in 2021, April 2021. And I've been to Gambia 4 times now, but when I read the book, I'd been to Gambia 3 times, yeah. And basically the book covers my first 3 experiences of Gambia. I first traveled to Gambia in December 2018. I went back in February 2019, and then I spent 6 months living in the Gambia from July until January, from July 2019 till January 2020. And the book encompasses, you know, the various aspects of my experience in the Gambia. So when I talk about my life in Gambia, when I first went to Gambia, the first 2 times it was on a holiday. Yeah, it was like a week each. A friend of mine had always been talking about going to Ghana or Africa in general. Me and him spoke, but he'd been Ghana and he'd been to other parts of Africa. But for me, this was my first trip to Africa. You know, as a Pan-Africanist and as a Rastafari, it's always been my dream and aspiration to, you know, to be on the continent. And when he told me he was going to Gambia this time, I made myself available from work, take the time off to go. And I had a great time when I got there. And basically, we're going to talk about it more going on, but I just want to talk about what the book in terms of, I had a great time going there, and then I decided to go back in February, and then I had another amazing time. So July is the 6 months that I spent living there, and most of the book, most of the book is encompassed on my 6 months in 2019 that I was there. So I went to, you know, naming ceremonies, I went to traditional wedding. Yeah, I worked on the Black Sit project with Juliet Ryan. Sorry, the Black Sit YouTube channel with Juliet Ryan, showcasing the Gambia. I went to many, you know, villages and did a lot of things that not the average local person does. Sorry, not the average tourist does. By going and, you know, interacting with a lot of, you know, the local people, and, you know, going to certain kind of places and the people that I met as well. So, you know, I thought that the book would be useful to highlight my journey, particularly the 6 months that I was living here, and also, you know, compare it a little bit as well, how I found it the first, like from, you know, going there as a visitor, as a tourist, and then also living here. So you can also get an idea a bit of, you know, the differences there, because obviously when you're going to a country as a tourist, you know, it's a bit of a honeymoon, it's romantic in a sense, but when you're living in a country, you know, it's a different scenario. So it encompasses, you know, all 3 of those journeys in there. And, you know, it even gives, you know, business tips, for example. It's like a part guide, part personal experience, but it talks about my personal experience, but also I point certain things like, you know, what possible business ideas that you could do in the Gambia once you're here, and, you know, just certain, like, general advice or things to look out for.
Yeah, that's amazing, because when I actually read the book, I too much love your description of it, and I also love the front cover, the way you make a sort of an illustration there. Now, as someone in diaspora, how do you feel visiting Gambia for the first time? How were you received? Do you have some remarkable experience visiting your homeland for the very first time?
Yeah, so I mean, my background is in terms of my family. My mom is, her parents are Jamaican, and my dad is from Malawi, which is in Southeast Africa.
Okay.
Yeah. I do, although as a Pan-Africanist, I see all countries in Africa as home. Yeah. How I was received, I did have some remarkable experiences. I was received very, very well by, the people in the Gambia, the smiling coast of Africa. I remember Bounty is a friend of mine now that I've stayed in contact with since the first day, and there's people that I met on the first day that I'm still in contact with this day in the Gambia, for example. And I think for me, having those relationships over the years, is something that's remarkable within itself. And when I remember Bounty, and I had a conversation because he was a caretaker at the hotel that I stayed in, and I was talking, and I mentioned this a lot. I was talking about people in diaspora coming home and repatriation and that kind of things, And I remember straight away he said to me, he was like, he said, you're a black man, this is your home. And the way that he was, like, he said it, and he like embraced me. And I think as soon as I kind of got off the plane, and it's something, the whole trip, the first week I was there, from the moment I got off the plane to the whole walking around in the environment, or the people that I met during there, it just resonated with my spirit. With everything, the hot weather, the communications I had, and I met some wonderful people throughout the 3 trips that I've been to the Gambia. I met wonderful people. I think that although I've been received well every time by the people of the Gambia, I'd say a divide in terms of how they see people in the diaspora. I mentioned some people like Bounty, and other people welcome us and see as Africans from the diaspora. But I think there is partly that is down to miseducation, because a lot of people, they can't, in the Gambia, they can't see how we're connected with Africa. So that's something that I also put in my book, and that I experienced, that people were welcoming to me, the work as a human. Love you as a brother, or respect you as a human being, but they won't necessarily see you as an African, as one of them. And to some extent, we are different. We're not black African people are not all one. We're not all the same. We're different complexions. We're different tribes. We're from different experiences, etc. So we'll get that, because you're not necessarily, you wasn't born in Gambia like them in that sense. But it's but they should still have a see, in terms of the connection of Gambia is the home of Kunta Kinte, in terms of everyone knows about the TV series Roots. Kunta Kinte and so many enslaved Africans were taken from the Gambia, and we are the descendants of those enslaved Africans that are coming home and returning. And yet the average Gambian on the ground doesn't know much about slavery, certainly not about what happened once those enslaved Africans were taken from Gambia and taken to the Caribbean and Americas and those places. So it's like we're always coming back home to our motherland, but we're being seen as foreigners and outsiders. Yeah, don't get me wrong, they'll love us, they're friendly people, they're nice, but they're not seeing how we are connected to Africa. And I would say that reflects the majority of Gambian people.
Wow, that's amazing. I love your answer to that. While reading through your book, Life in Gambia, I love to say that I love your perception about the difference between race and nationality. Could you tell us a bit about this?
Yeah, so nationality is the country that you're born in. So if you're born in Nigeria, that's your nationality. If you're born in England, that's your nationality. If you're born in America, that's your nationality. If you're born in Japan, that's your nationality. Whatever country you're born in, you are the nationality of the country.
Yeah.
Your ethnicity and stroke race is different. So even if you're born as a black person in the diaspora, if you're born in negate the fact that you're still African, but you're an African that was born in England or in America or whatever country you were born in. Like, you know, Peter Tosh says, as long as you're a black man, regardless of where you're born from, you have the identity of an African. It gets mixed up, certainly for Gambia and how they view nationality and how they view race. It's almost like if you're in the diaspora, all of a sudden you're English and you're American, for example, and that's almost like seen as like your race in a sense. I've heard people, you know, on the continent, Gambians and people that were been in Gambia but from other African countries, and you know they refer themselves as, you know what, different races or mixed because they're still African, but they've got two parents that are from two different African countries. So they would say, you know, they're half caste, yeah, which in a sense, which is weird. I mean, because it's still part of the same race. It's just like they're still African, or they're still, but I get in a sense is they're mixed in terms, they've got mixed heritage in terms of, you know, what they're like, for example, their parents have got different nationalities, but they still belong to, you know, if you want to say the African race, they're still, you know, black people. And I think sometimes we as a people, particularly Africans on the continent, have and from my experience of the Gambia, but also in the diaspora of coming in contact with, you know, Africans in general, they seem to look at people based on, you know, just their nationality of where they're born, rather than, you know, what their heritage and, you know, their ethnicity.
Wow, that's great, because that's also one of the things that I've seen that most people do mix up. Now, in your book, Life in Gambia, you also wrote about a young man named Osman. You know, I watched a video of this man together with someone you call Juliet thereabout, and how you really talk about him. Now, could you tell us about Osman?
Yeah, so I met Osman at the Pan-African Young Leadership Awards, which happened in the Gambia when I was there in 2019 during my 6 months in Gambia. And during the 6 months in Gambia, I was working with Juliet Ryan and doing videos for a YouTube channel called Blacksit. So Juliet was, you know, the founder, presenter of the YouTube channel. I was the video editor, you know, and also the editor, and you know, I directed some of the videos as well. Yeah, and we met Osman at that young Pan-African Young Leadership Awards. He said that he'd watched some of our videos on Blacksit, and he saw the video that I was interviewed by Julia, and he saw other videos, and he was inspired because it showcased, you know, the reality of the Gambia, and put Gambia, showcase Gambia to the world, so people can see, you know, what life is like in the Gambia. And Julia decided to interview him, and they interviewed him. I filmed the video. Wow. And that video went up on Blacksit, and that clip has gone viral. So even when I came back to England, and I was seeing, before I came back to Gambia, I was seeing, you know, a lot of people's post that video. I was getting messages on WhatsApp and seeing it on social media and places. Even Julius Malema, you know, he, from the, you know, economic freedom fighters in South Africa, he made a post about commenting on that and saying the future of Africa looks bright. And because of, you know, what Osman Torre was saying, Osman Torre, for his son, why he wanted to study, went to go study in Rwanda instead. And there's a lot of, you know, young black people that their aspirations is to go to Europe, and they would certainly want to go study at university in Europe, particularly if they had scholarship and it was funded. But Osman decided that he wanted to, you know, to stay on the continent and go to university in Rwanda. And you know, I think that inspired a lot of people, and also the way that things that Osman said in that interview about, you know, no one's going to do it for us. It's we that have to do it for ourselves. And you know, change the narrative of Africa. So I mean, if you haven't seen it already, check out the interview. It was a powerful interview by Osman Toure, and that I still stay in touch with Osman. But since that video, Osman has gone, I think, from strength to strength. He's part of the Professor Lumumba Foundation in Rwanda. He's been an ambassador I think the University of the Gambia, and I think it was in Ghana. It was also he was made something to do with a museum, but he's gone to different countries around, different African countries around the world, and he and spoke as spokesman of Pan-Africanism, and he's gone on to do some to advocate really effectively Pan-Africanism. And I think he's inspired a lot of people. A lot of people have seen him as as a young leader that's got I think his mindset in the right place. And he's passionate about Africa, about the continent, and about staying in Africa. And I think why was popular because, particularly as well, because many of us with Pan-Africanism, we're coming from the diaspora, but the people that people don't always see in the limelight, young Pan-Africanists, or they're not always given that exposure, that were directly born on the continent. So I think that's why Osman was become such, very, very popular.
I was also going to ask you, what was your most unique experience living in the Gambia?
So I think the most unique experience and a big highlight of my time in the Gambia was working with Juliet Ryan on Black Sit YouTube channel. Okay. And people for the work that I did with Black Sit, people from all over the world. And I mentioned a bit earlier, I did this is how I met Osman, but I did the video editing and the filming, showcase Africa, particularly the Gambia, in a more positive light. So we went to different places. We filmed medical centers, we filmed supermarkets, we filmed businesses, and spoke to Gambian business owners. And we spoke to certain a minister, we spoke to people that were big business owners and the movers and shakers of the Gambia, really. And it was basically to change the narrative that a lot of people think, because a lot of people still have a negative view of how they look at Africa, and they look down on Africa, and they still see it as jungles and mud hut and these kind of things. So it's to show people that a lot of the things that are in the Western world that you don't think is in Africa, that exist in Africa. There's some people, and some people that are living a better life in Africa, and through Black Sit, which is as a result of that, videos have made a massive impact on people, and a lot of people are now here. So we're talking about hundreds, maybe even 1,000 people that are here as a result of watching those videos. That's something that has made an impact on the economy, and made those they would never have dreamed or never have thought about the Gambia as even an option of thinking about relocation, or maybe they didn't even have repatriation to Africa, but they was inspired so much by it. It's not easy. It's not an easy thing to just all of a sudden to move from one country to the other. It requires a lot of preparation, a lot of work. And some people now that are here, that are living their best lives in the Gambia, better than the lives that they would have been living that they lived in the diaspora, in the past life. And a lot of it is down to the work that myself and Juliet did in making in how in what we did in terms of the videos and the variety of different kinds of videos that we did to showcase the best parts of the Gambia, because I mentioned some of the kind of videos that we did, but we also did hotels, we did restaurants, we did we went out to naming ceremonies, a naming ceremony we filmed. The impact, we had about 10,000 people on average that was watching our videos. So we had a massive viewership, and I did that, worked on that for about 3-4 months before I came back to England. But I think that sticks out to me in terms of the people I met there, the people I interviewed, that we interviewed, and the impact they had as a whole in terms of people relocating to the motherland.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, because actually while I read the book, you talk about Black Sit channel, so I checked it on YouTube, and I think I did subscribe to it. I also watched the video where you wrote that Juliet said, what's it called? England is a dump thereabout. England is a dump. I think I watched that video too, where you made with the popular YouTuber thereabout. So it's pretty much amazing to get to know about all of this in the book, and everything was just quite intriguing to me.
Yeah, well, that video where Juliet said England is a dump, that's really And one of my actually at that time was visiting the Gambia in 2019. I think it was August he came to the Gambia, whatever, and he met Julia and he did an interview with Julia. And then that's the interview where she said England was a dump. And I think he was so attracted to the energy that Julia has. Julia does have an amazing energy, and he then decided to set up a YouTube channel for Julia which is the making of the Blacksit YouTube channel, because he thought he could tell that she would be a good promoter of the Gambia and ambassador of the Gambia, and then the YouTube channel was founded. And that's already how Blacksit emerged. And then I was contacted, how I came part of Blacksit, I was contacted by Julia. We knew of each other in the UK, but we hadn't met each other directly before. Julia contacted me and said that she would like to do an interview with me for Blacksit. And then so I came to her house, I did the interview, and then she said, she's looking for someone that could possibly help with filming and video editing. And I had expertise. I've got a degree in sports journalism, and I used to do home videos and that kind of stuff. And I like journalistic work. So I said, we could work together on this. I could do the video editing and the filming for your videos. And then that's how, since then, that's how my involvement became part of Blacksit.
So thank you so much, Makonnen Sankofa, for coming up on the show. For viewers, you would like to get a copy of his books, I've left a link in the description part of this interview for you to get a copy directly on Amazon. It's a pleasure having you on the show, Makonnen Sankofa.
Thank you for having me, Peter. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.